The coffee in Staff Sergeant Maya Vance's ceramic mug was exactly 104 degrees, lukewarm and oily. When Lieutenant Bennett leaned over her shoulder in the Tactical Operations Center and crossed her name off the lead element list for the midnight sweep of the Gambary Ridge. It was 19:00 hours at Combat Outpost Blackbird, a jagged collection of Hesco bastions and plywood shacks tucked into a fold of the Hindu Kush that the sun had forgotten 3 hours ago. The air inside the TOC smelled of ozone, unwashed bodies, and the scorched metal scent of overworked server racks. Maya didn't look up from the topographic map on her screen. She didn't need to see Bennett's face to know the expression on it. She had been reading the subtle twitch of his jaw and the overeager brightness in his eyes since they had staged out of Fort Drum 6 months ago. He was a man who viewed the world as a series of obstacles to be conquered by volume, while Maya viewed it as a series of tensions to be balanced. "I need hitters on this one, Vance," Bennett said, his voice carrying that specific, polished projection of a West Point graduate who had never had to bleed for a decision. He didn't whisper. He wanted the 3 privates at the comms desk and the platoon sergeant by the door to hear him. "The Gambary is a vertical environment. It's about aggression and pace. I can't have anyone lagging behind or overthinking the ROE when the shadows start moving. You're better suited for the overwatch position here on the South Rampart." Maya felt the heat of the rejection, not as a flare of temper, but as a steady, localized pressure behind her ribs. She was 32 years old, born and raised on a cattle ranch outside of Casper, Wyoming, where the wind didn't just blow, it interrogated you. She had spent her childhood learning how to move through brush without snapping a twig, and how to drop a buck from 400 yards when her hands were so cold they felt like wooden blocks. She had joined the army because the ranch was dying, and the quiet of the plains had started to feel like an unfinished sentence. She had stayed because she found she possessed a terrifying, silent efficiency that most people mistake for hesitation. "The ridge has 3 blind spots in the thermal sweep, sir," Maya said, her voice a flat, steady low. She didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes on the contour lines of the Gambary. "The drainage pipe on the eastern slope has a silt buildup that mutes the seismic sensors. If I'm on the rampart, I'm looking at the wrong side of the mountain. You need a scout in the notch or you're walking into a funnel." Bennett let out a short, sharp huff of air that was technically a laugh. He tapped his finger on the desk right next to Maya's hand. His fingernails were perfectly manicured, a stark contrast to the grease under Maya's own. "Your concern is noted, Staff Sergeant, but I'm looking for momentum. You've been, let's call it deliberate since we hit the valley. Some of the guys are starting to think you're the weak link in the chain. I can't have the encoic of the sweep being the one everyone has to wait for. You'll stay on the wall, that's an order." He turned and walked away, his boots clacking on the raised plywood flooring. Maya didn't move. She watched a dust mote drift through the blue light of the monitors. She could feel the eyes of the young privates on her. They were 19, 20 years old, fueled by rippets and a desperate need to prove they weren't afraid. They saw Bennett's bravado as leadership and Maya's silence as a lack of nerve. They didn't see the way she spent her off-shift hours in the dark behind the motor pool, practicing the fluid, circular motions of Filipino Kali with a training blade until her shoulders burned. They didn't know that she could dismantle an M249 SAW blindfolded in under 40 seconds, or that she had once tracked a wounded mountain lion for 3 days across the Bighorn Mountains just to ensure it didn't suffer. She picked up her mug and took a sip of the oily coffee. It was cold now. Across the room, Corporal Elias Thorne, a lanky kid from Ohio with a permanent squint and a radio pack that seemed part of his skeleton, caught her eye. Thorne was the only one who had been with her during the ambush at Red Creek 3 months prior. He had seen her move when the world turned into fire and screaming. He had seen her pull a pinned private out of a burning Humvee while suppressed by 2 PKM machine guns, her face as calm as a frozen lake. He didn't say anything. He just gave her a slow, barely perceptible nod and went back to his headset. He knew what the others didn't, that Maya Vance wasn't slow. She was just waiting for the world to catch up to her. The sun finally dipped entirely behind the jagged teeth of the horizon, plunging COP Blackbird into a bruised purple twilight. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 20 minutes, a physical weight that pressed the smell of wood smoke from the local village deep into the lungs of the soldiers. Maya walked out of the TOC and headed toward the armory. The base was a symphony of industrial noise. The constant, low-frequency thrum of the 100 kW generators, the metallic clatter of the mess hall, the distant, rhythmic thud of a mortar team practicing their registrations. She found her locker and began the ritual. It was the only time she felt truly herself, the moment when the layers of military protocol and social expectation were replaced by the literal weight of her gear. She checked her plate carrier, ensuring the ceramic inserts were seated perfectly. She checked her primary, a suppressed M4A1 with a Trigic ACOG. She ran her thumb over the charging handle, the metal smooth and familiar. But it was the knife that mattered most. It was a custom-built fixed blade, 7 inches of high-carbon steel with a matte black finish, tucked into a Kydex sheath on the left side of her chest rig. She had sharpened it that morning until it could split a falling hair. As she worked, the squad for the midnight sweep filtered in. They were loud, their voices bouncing off the corrugated metal walls of the armory. They were talking about football, about girls back home in Savannah and San Diego, about what they were going to eat when they finally got a R&R pass to Bagram. Bennett was there, standing in the center of the room, checking his GPS with an intensity that felt performed. "Vance," he called out, not looking up. "Make sure the NVGs for the Rampart team are calibrated. I don't want any blurry optics when we're out there." "Already done, sir," Maya said. She was tightening the laces on her Salomon boots, her fingers moving with a mechanical precision. "Good, stay sharp. If the ridge stays quiet, maybe we'll get you on the next one." The condescension was a physical film in the air. Maya felt it, but she didn't let it in. She stood up, her gear clicking into place. She was a shadow among the bright, noisy boys. She watched them file out, 30 men laden with tech and ammunition, headed for the main gate where the strikers were idling, their exhaust plumes white in the freezing air. She watched the tail lights of the last vehicle disappear into the maw of the valley, and then she turned and headed for the South Rampart. The South Rampart was the loneliest place on COP Blackbird. It was a narrow walkway atop the HESCO, overlooking a steep, shale-covered slope that led down to a dry riverbed. The wind up here was a living thing, a biting, relentless force that searched for any gap in a soldier's layers. Maya took her position behind a M240B machine gun, but she didn't touch the weapon. She pulled her thermal binocular from its pouch and began a slow, methodical scan of the Gambari Ridge, 3 miles to the north. She didn't look for people. People were easy to hide. She looked for anomalies. She looked for the way the heat of the earth was trapped in the rocks and how that heat was interrupted. She looked for the V shapes of disturbed vegetation. She looked for the specific, rhythmic sway of a branch that didn't match the wind. An hour passed, then 2. The radio in her ear was a constant stream of Bennett's voice, directing the sweep. They were moving through the lower draws, clearing empty caves and abandoned shepherd huts. Everything was green. Everything was secure. Bennett sounded bored, his voice tinged with the frustration of a man who wanted a fight to justify his rank. Maya shifted her focus. She didn't look at where the sweep was. She looked at where they had been, and then she saw it. It was a flicker. A pinprick of heat on the eastern slope, near the drainage pipe she had mentioned in the TOC. It was gone before she could blink, but the image was burned into her retinas. It wasn't a muzzle flash. It was a heat signature, small, concentrated, and moving vertically. She adjusted the gain on the thermals. There, another one, and another. They weren't coming from the ridge. They were coming from the valley floor, moving up behind the sweep. They were using the silted-over drainage pipe to bypass the seismic sensors, just as she had feared. But they weren't targeting the sweep. They were moving toward the notch, the narrow pass that served as the only exit for the ridge. If they took the notch, Bennett and his 30 men would be trapped in a kill box with 200-foot rock walls on either side. Maya keyed her mic. "Blue lead, this is Sentry 6. I have multiple heat signatures, approximately 12 to 15 individuals, moving toward the notch, grid 44 Alpha 9er. They are utilizing the drainage concealment. Do you copy?" There was a long silence, filled only with the static of the mountain air. Then Bennett's voice came through, sounding annoyed. "Sentry 6, this is Blue Lead. We've cleared that sector. You're seeing ghosting on the thermals, Vance. The atmospheric inversion is high tonight. Stick to your sector." "Sir, these aren't ghosts. They are moving in a staggered file. They have heavy equipment. If they reach the notch before you backtrack, you're cut off." "Vance, enough," Bennett snapped. "I'm not turning this element around because you're jumpy on a wall. We have the drone overhead. If there was movement, the TOC would see it." Maya looked back at the TOC. The drone feed was likely focused on the sweep's current position 3 miles away. The eye in the sky was narrow-visioned, seeing only what it was told to see. She looked back through her thermals. The figures were moving faster now. They were less than a kilometer from the notch. And then she saw something that made her blood turn to ice. One of the figures stopped. It turned toward the COP. For a split second, it looked directly into the thermal lens. The heat signature was different, brighter, more defined. The figure was holding something. A radio? No, a designator. Maya didn't wait for the next command. She didn't wait for the TOC to wake up. She knew the geography of this valley better than she knew the back of her own hand. She knew that if she stayed on the wall, she would watch 30 men die in a matter of minutes. She stepped off the rampart and hit the ground running. She didn't go through the main gate. She went to the motor pool, where the perimeter fence had a small, reinforced gap for the drainage runoff, a gap she had personally inspected and widened 2 weeks ago during a maintenance detail. She slid through it, the jagged wire catching on her sleeve, drawing a thin line of blood she didn't feel. She was out. The darkness outside the COP was absolute. It wasn't the darkness of a city or even a rural town. It was a prehistoric, heavy blackness that felt like it had weight. Maya didn't turn on her NVGs yet. She let her eyes adjust, using the faint starlight reflecting off the shale. She moved with a strange, high-stepping gait, her feet finding the solid rocks and avoiding the loose scree. She breathed through her nose, deep and rhythmic, keeping her heart rate below 100. She was 2 miles from the notch. The terrain was a nightmare of vertical drops and razor-sharp outcroppings. To anyone else, it was impassable at night. To Maya, it was the ranch in Wyoming during a blizzard. It was the same math, the same stakes. She reached the base of the eastern slope in 12 minutes. Her lungs were screaming, the thin mountain air tasting like copper. She paused, pressing her back against a cold slab of granite, and pulled her NVGs down over her eyes. The world turned into a grainy, electric green. She saw them. They were 200 yards above her, crested on a small plateau just below the notch. They weren't local insurgents. They moved with a professional, rhythmic discipline. Their gear was clean, their movements coordinated. In the center of the group was the man she had seen on the thermals. He was taller than the others, wearing a tactical vest and a headset. He was the commander. He was the one holding the designator. They were setting up an ambush. 2 PKMs were being tripod-mounted on the flanks. 3 men were prepping RPG-7s. They were going to wait until Bennett's strikers entered the narrowest part of the pass, and then they were going to turn the notch into a furnace. Maya looked at her radio. She could try to call it in again, but she knew the hills would eat the signal from this low. And even if she got through, Bennett wouldn't believe her until the first rocket hit his lead vehicle. She looked at her M4. If she started shooting, she might kill 2, maybe 3 of them before the rest swarmed her. She was 1 woman against 15. The math was wrong, unless she changed the variables. She slung the rifle across her back, cinching the strap so tight it bruised her chest. She checked her knife. She checked the 2 flashbangs on her belt. She didn't feel fear. Fear was for people who had a choice. Maya Vance didn't have a choice. She had a mission. She began to climb. She didn't use the path. She went straight up the rock face, using the cracks and the frozen moss for grip. Her fingers bled. Her knees scraped against the granite. She moved like a spider, silent and purposeful. She was 30 feet below the plateau when she heard the sound of a striker's engine in the distance. Bennett was coming. He was 5 minutes away. Maya reached the edge of the plateau. A sentry was standing 5 feet away, his back to her, watching the trail below through a pair of high-end binoculars. He was humming a low, repetitive tune. Maya didn't breathe. She didn't think. She simply flowed over the edge of the rock. She was on him before his brain could register the shift in the air. Her left hand came around his face, palm flat against his mouth, fingers hooking into the jawbone to pull his head back. Her right hand drove the knife into the base of his skull, right where the spine met the brain. It was a surgical, terrifyingly precise movement. The man went limp instantly. She caught his body, easing it down to the dirt so his gear didn't clatter. 1 down, 14 to go. She stayed in the shadows of the rocks, moving toward the center of the plateau. The enemy commander was standing by the PKM on the left flank, pointing toward the trail. He was talking into a radio, his voice a low, gravelly rasp in a language Maya didn't recognize, but the tone was universal. It was the tone of a predator who had already tasted the kill. The 2 RPG gunners were 10 feet to Maya's right, kneeling in the dirt, their weapons resting on their shoulders. She needed to take out the commander. If she took him out, the coordination would shatter. But he was surrounded by his inner circle. She reached into her pouch and pulled out a small, heavy object, a weighted distraction device she'd made from a spent 40 casing and some lead shot. She tossed it. It landed 30 feet to the left, near the far edge of the plateau, with a sharp *clack* against the stone. 4 of the men, including the commander's immediate guard, turned toward the sound. 2 of them started moving toward it, their rifles raised. The commander stayed where he was, looking at his watch. Maya moved. She didn't run, she lunged. She was a blur of gray and tan against the dark rock. She covered the distance in 3 strides. The commander heard something, a scuff of a boot, a rustle of fabric, and started to turn, his hand reaching for the pistol at his hip. He was fast, but Maya was desperate. She didn't use her knife. She didn't want the glint of steel. She slammed her shoulder into his chest, driving the air from his lungs. As they hit the ground, she wrapped her legs around his waist in a grapevine lock and shoved her forearm under his chin, pulling his head back with a sickening force. He fought. He was strong, stronger than any man she had ever faced. He clawed at her eyes, his fingers tearing at her NVGs, ripping them from her helmet. He tried to scream, but Maya's forearm was a bar of iron across his throat. They rolled. They were a tangle of limbs and gasping breath in the dirt. The other men were shouting now, realized something was wrong, but they couldn't shoot. They couldn't see who was who in the chaos of the dark. Maya felt a sharp pain in her side, a knife, a bayonet. She didn't care. She tightened the choke. She felt the commander's pulse racing against her arm, a frantic, drum-like beat that began to slow. She saw his eyes in the faint starlight, wide, bulging, filled with a sudden, localized terror as he realized he was dying in the hands of something he couldn't even see. His movements became spasmodic. His hands dropped from her face. His legs stopped kicking. Maya didn't let go. She counted to 10, her teeth bared in a silent, primal snarl. When she finally released him, he was a dead weight. She rolled off him, her lungs burning, her vision swimming with dark spots. She reached for her M4, but a boot slammed into her ribs, sending her spinning across the dirt. She looked up. 3 men were standing over her, their rifles pointed at her head. At that exact moment, the lead striker's headlights rounded the bend of the trail, 500 yards below. The enemy soldiers hesitated. Their commander was dead. The ambush was compromised. The headlights were a giant, accusing eye in the dark. Maya didn't wait for them to decide. She reached for the flashbang on her belt, ripped the pin, and held it for a 2 count before dropping it at her own feet. The world exploded in white light, and a sound that felt like it was trying to peel the skin off her bones. Maya had closed her eyes and covered her ears, but the concussion still felt like a physical blow to her brain. She scrambled to her feet, her inner ear screaming, her balance shattered. She didn't need to see. She knew the layout. She lunged forward, her hands finding the cold steel of a PKM tripod. She shoved it, sending the heavy machine gun tumbling over the edge of the cliff. She heard shouting. Gunfire. The rhythmic asterisk thud 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 asterisk of the strikers. 50 caliber machine gun opening up from below. She fell back into the shadows, her hands searching the dirt until they found her M4. She didn't aim. She just fired into the center of the white light haze where the enemy had been. And then silence. The white light faded into a dull, throbbing gray. Maya slumped against a rock, her breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. She could feel the blood now, a warm, steady flow from her side and a stinging heat across her face. Her NVGs were gone, her helmet was crooked. She heard boots on the trail, heavy, rhythmic American boots. "Check the plateau," a voice shouted. It was Thorne. "Watch the corners, don't get lazy." That was Bennett. Maya tried to stand, but her legs felt like they were made of water. She slid down the rock, her head resting against the cold stone. She watched the beams of tactical lights sweep across the plateau, illuminating the bodies of the insurgents and the slumped, lifeless form of the commander. A light hit her face, blinding her. "Contact, 1 individual, don't move." "Wait!" Thorne's voice was a roar. "Wait, that's Vance, that's Staff Sergeant Vance." The lights converged on her. Maya squinted, her hand shielding her eyes. She saw the silhouettes of the squad, the boys she had watched leave the armory 2 hours ago. They were standing in a semicircle, their rifles lowered, their faces masks of shock and confusion. Bennett pushed through the group. He looked at the dead commander. He looked at the destroyed PKM position. He looked at Maya, who was covered in dirt, blood, and the gray dust of the plateau. He didn't say anything for a long time. The only sound was the idling of the strikers below and the wind whistling through the notch. "Vance," Bennett finally whispered. His voice was stripped of its polish. He looked small. What did you do?" Maya looked at him. She saw the fear in his eyes, not the fear of the enemy, but the fear of a man who had just realized he didn't know anything about the world he was trying to lead. She didn't answer him. She didn't need to. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her ceramic mug, which she had somehow inexplicably tucked into a cargo pocket before she left, and set it on the dirt. It was cracked down the middle. "The ridge is clear, sir," Maya said, her voice a rasping, hollow sound. The weak link held. She tried to stand again, and this time Thorne was there. He caught her under the arm, his grip steady and fierce. He didn't say a word, but the way he held her, the way he looked at the dead commander and then back at her, was the only validation she would ever need. Bennett stepped toward her, his hand reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, but he stopped. He looked at her face, the cold, controlled mask that was now shattered by pain and exhaustion, and he saw the person he had dismissed. He saw the dark competence he had mistaken for hesitation. "We need a medevac," Bennett said, his voice shaking. "Get the RTO on the horn, we need a bird now." "I can walk," Maya said. "No, you can't," Thorne said softly. "Just shut up for once, Staff Sergeant, let us carry you." Maya closed her eyes. She felt the weight of the night beginning to settle into her bones. She had saved them. She had saved the boys who didn't like her and the officer who didn't trust her. She had done it because it was the mission, and the mission was the only thing that was real. But as they lifted her onto a litter, as the rotors of the approaching Black Hawk began to thump in the distance, Maya felt something else. A cold, sharp realization. She looked at the commander's body one last time. In his hand, clutched in a death grip, was a small, high-frequency transmitter. It wasn't a radio for the ambush. It was a beacon, and the beacon was still blinking. Maya tried to speak, tried to tell Thorne that this wasn't the end, that the ambush was just the distraction for something much, much bigger. But the world was fading. The white light of the flashbang was returning, pulling her down into the quiet. The last thing she felt was the vibration of the helicopter through the ground, a rhythm that didn't match the heartbeat of the mountain. They weren't alone. They had never been alone, and the man she had killed was just the beginning of the cost. Maya Vance let the darkness take her, her hand still curled into a fist, her mind already calculating the next move in a game that no one else even knew they were playing. The medevac flight was a blur of shouting and the metallic taste of an oxygen mask. Maya floated in the liminal space between consciousness and the deep, cold quiet of the ranch in Casper. She felt the pressure of Thorne's hand on her shoulder, a grounding weight against the swaying of the helicopter. She wanted to tell him about the beacon, but her jaw felt like it was wired shut, and every time she tried to draw a breath, the world fractured into jagged shards of green and black. By the time they touched down at the surgical unit at Bagram Airfield, the adrenaline had completely bled out, leaving her hollow. The surgeons worked with a grim, practiced speed. They stripped her gear, the plate carrier she'd cinched so tightly, the boots that had carried her up the rock face, the blood-stained uniform. They found the wound in her side, a clean puncture from a sharpened piece of rebar one of the insurgents had used as a makeshift pike. It had missed her vitals by an inch. Maya watched the ceiling tiles of the recovery ward. They were white, sterile, and perfectly square. It was the first time in 6 months she hadn't been surrounded by the chaos of the valley, and the silence was deafening. Lieutenant Bennett visited her 3 days later. He didn't come with the usual officer's bravado. He looked tired. His uniform was rumpled, and he was carrying a small manila folder. He sat in the plastic chair next to her bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "The report is being finalized," he said, not looking at her. "I wrote it myself. I made sure the details were accurate, Vance, everything you did at the notch. The way you bypassed the sensors, the engagement on the plateau. I recommended you for the Silver Star." Maya looked at him. The word recommendation felt heavy and useless, like a gift given to a person who had lost their hands. "Thank you, sir. The colonel wants to see you when you're mobile," Bennett continued. He finally looked up, and for the first time Maya saw a flicker of something human in his eyes, a genuine, unvarnished guilt. "He asked me why my scout NCO was 2 miles away from her post without orders. I told him I sent you on a flanking maneuver. I told him it was part of the plan." Maya's expression didn't change. "You lied to the colonel." "I protected the unit," Bennett snapped, his old defensiveness flaring for a second before dying out. "If I told him the truth, that you went rogue because I was too arrogant to listen to your intel, it would have destroyed the platoon's credibility, and yours." "You protected yourself, sir," Maya said quietly. "But that's okay, I didn't do it for the report." Bennett stood up, his face flushing. He opened the manila folder and pulled out a photograph. It was a grainy image from a long-range surveillance camera taken 48 hours after the incident at the notch. "You were right about the drainage pipe," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. We sent a recon team back in. They found a tunnel system that hadn't been on any of our maps. It goes deep into the mountain, but that's not why I'm here." He slid the photograph onto her lap. It showed a small, dusty courtyard in a village 10 miles from the notch. In the center of the courtyard was a man standing next to a black SUV. He was dressed in a Western-style suit, looking entirely out of place in the rugged terrain. He was holding the same type of high-frequency transmitter Maya had seen in the commander's hand. "This man is Julian Vane," Bennett said. "He's a former contractor. CIA-linked, but went off the grid 3 years ago. We think he's the one who was coordinating the ambush. The commander you killed, he was Vane's primary liaison." Maya looked at the photograph. She felt a cold prickle of recognition. It wasn't the man's face, it was his posture. The way he stood was the way a man stands when he owns the ground beneath him. "Why would a contractor be setting up an ambush for a U.S. platoon?" Maya asked. "We don't know," Bennett said. "But the beacon you saw, it wasn't for the ambush. We tracked the signal before it cut out. It wasn't pointing at the valley, it was pointing at the COP." Maya sat up. The movement sent a flare of white-hot pain through her side. "The COP is the target." "Not the COP," Bennett said, leaning in. "The TOC, the server racks. Vane isn't interested in killing soldiers, Vance. He's interested in the data we've been collecting on the lithium deposits in the northern sector. The ambush was supposed to draw the entire element out, leaving the base on a skeleton crew." Maya felt the air leave her lungs. "If I hadn't stopped the ambush, the sweep would have been trapped, and the COP would have been overrun by a second team we didn't even know was there," Bennett finished. "You didn't just save 30 men, Vance. You saved the entire operation." He reached out and put a hand on her arm. It was a brief, awkward gesture. "I called you a weak link. I was wrong. You're the only thing that held us together." Maya watched him leave, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. She looked back at the photograph of Julian Vane. She knew that Bennett thought the threat was over, that the recommendation and the report would put a bow on the incident. But Maya knew better. She knew the way men like Vane operated. They didn't walk away after a failed attempt. They just recalibrated. She looked at her hand, the hand that had killed a man in the dark. It was steady. She reached for the phone on the bedside table and dialed a number she had memorized years ago, back when she was just a girl in Wyoming wondering if there was more to the world than wind and dirt. "This is Vance," she said when the line picked up. "I need a transfer. No, not a medical discharge. I need to go to the 75th. I have a debt to collect." She hung up the phone and looked out the window at the distant, jagged mountains. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows across the airfield. Maya Vance wasn't a weak link. She was the anchor, and the storm was just beginning. 4 days later, Staff Sergeant Maya Vance walked out of the hospital under her own power. She moved with a slight limp, and her side was taped tight, but her eyes were clear. She didn't go back to COP Blackbird. She didn't wait for the medal ceremony. She went to the flight line and boarded a C-130 headed for an undisclosed location in Jordan. She left her ceramic mug behind, broken and empty, on the bedside table. As the plane climbed into the thin, cold air, Maya looked down at the valley one last time. She saw the notch, a tiny gap in the earth where she had proven who she was. She didn't feel pride. She didn't feel relief. She felt the weight of the mission. The report would say she was a hero. The medals would say she was brave. But Maya Vance knew the truth. She was a hunter, and she had finally found a trail worth following. In the back of the C-130, surrounded by the roar of the engines and the smell of jet fuel, Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, blackened piece of metal she had scavenged from the plateau. It was a pin from a flashbang, the one she had dropped at her own feet. She ran her thumb over the smooth, curved surface. It was a reminder of the cost. It was a reminder that in the dark, silence was the only thing that kept you alive. She closed her eyes and let the vibration of the plane settle into her molars. She was going back into the shadows. She was going to find Julian Vane. And this time, she wouldn't be waiting for the world to catch up to her. She would be the one leading the way. The desert of Jordan was a different kind of empty than Wyoming, but the heat felt the same. A relentless, searching pressure that stripped away everything but the essentials. Maya stood on the edge of a dusty training compound, watching a group of rangers run through a live-fire exercise. She was wearing a plain tan t-shirt and cargo pants, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe knot. A man walked up to her, his face weathered by decades of sun and salt. He was a master sergeant, a man who had seen everything the Army had to offer and had survived it all. "Vance?" he asked. "Yes, Sergeant Major." He looked at her for a long time, his eyes scanning the scar on her face and the way she held herself, the controlled, lethal stillness of a predator. "I read your file," he said. "The official version, and the one the Corporal Thorne sent me on a private channel." Maya didn't blink. "Thorne has a big mouth. Thorne has a sense of loyalty," the Master Sergeant corrected. "He told me what happened on that plateau. He told me how you took down a commander with your bare hands while 30 men were looking the other way." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "We're putting together a team. It's not a standard deployment. It's a hunt. We're looking for a ghost named Vane." Maya looked at him. She felt the tension in her chest begin to ease, replaced by a cold, sharp purpose. "When do we start?" she asked. The Master Sergeant smiled, a grim, humorless expression. "We already started, Vance. Pick up your gear. We're moving out at 0400. Maya turned and walked toward the barracks. The sun was high and brutal, casting no shadows. She felt the weight of the knife at her side, not the one she had used at the notch, but a new one, balanced and sharp and ready. She wasn't the weak link. She was the one who would finish it. And as she stepped into the cool, dark interior of the barracks, Maya Vance finally allowed herself a single, fleeting thought of home. The wind in Wyoming, the smell of the grass, the quiet of the plains. She would go back there someday. But not yet. Not until the silence was earned. The mission was the only thing left, and Maya Vance was the mission. The barracks in the King Abdullah Roman II Special Operations Training Center smelled of floor wax and the ghosts of 1,000 men who had passed through on their way to becoming something harder. Maya sat on the edge of her cot, her fingers tracing the jagged, angry line of the scar on her side. It was still tender, a reminder of the rebar that had tried to claim her, but the pain was a grounding wire. It reminded her that she was still anchored to the earth when her mind wanted to drift back to the white light of the flashbang. Outside, the Jordanian sun was a hammer, beating against the corrugated roofs of the compound, but inside the shadows were long and cool. She was waiting for Thorne. He had arrived 6 hours after her, looking like he'd been dragged through the gears of a machine, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling just enough that only Maya would notice. She didn't look up when the heavy steel door at the end of the hall groaned on its hinges. She knew the cadence of his stride, the slight drag of his left heel that had developed after 3 months of carrying a 70-pound ruck through the Hindu Kush. Thorne stopped at the foot of her bed. He didn't offer a greeting. He just held out a cardboard tray with 2 paper cups of coffee. The steam smelled of burnt beans and chicory, a scent that felt more like home than any barracks ever could. Maya took the cup. The heat seeped into her palms, loosening the tension in her knuckles. She took a sip, the bitter liquid coating her tongue. She looked at him then, really looked at him. The boyishness was gone. The kid who had squinted at his radio in the TOC at Blackbird had been replaced by a man whose face was a map of everything he had been forced to see. "You didn't have to come, Elias," Maya said. Her voice was low, barely a vibration in the quiet room. Thorne sat on the edge of the cot across from her, his knees nearly touching hers. He stared at his own coffee, his shoulders hunched. "They asked for volunteers for the task force. I saw your name on the manifest. I figured somebody had to keep an eye on you before you decided to tackle a whole battalion with nothing but a pocket knife." "I had a flashbang," Maya said, a ghost of a smile touching the corner of her mouth. "Yeah, well, next time try using it from a distance." Thorne's voice was rough, but there was a current of fierce, unspoken loyalty beneath it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He smoothed it out against his thigh. It was a printout of the personnel roster for the new unit, Task Force 88. At the top of the list under the commander's name was Julian Vane, not as a target, but as a consultant. Maya felt the air in the room thicken. She leaned forward, the coffee forgotten in her lap. "What is this?" "It was in the briefing packet they gave us at Bagram before the flight," Thorne whispered. "The official story is that Vane is a subject matter expert. They're saying his contact with the insurgents at the Notch was part of a deep-cover intelligence operation. They're saying you almost blew a 3-year-long CIA play, Maya." The pressure behind Maya's ribs returned, a cold, localized weight that felt like ice water in her veins. She thought of the commander she had killed. She thought of the look in his eyes, the pure, unadulterated terror of a man who knew he had been abandoned by his masters. She thought of the beacon. "He wasn't a consultant, Elias. He was the architect," Maya said. "The beacon was pointing at the TOC. He wanted the servers. He didn't want the valley. He wanted the data." "I know that, you know that," Thorne said. He looked toward the door, his jaw tight. But the guys in the suits in Virginia, they see a man who can give them the keys to the lithium mines. They don't care about 30 soldiers in a ditch. They care about the resource map. They're bringing him in, Maya. He's going to be in the wire with us. Maya stood up. The movement was fluid, despite the stitch in her side. She walked to the small, barred window and looked out at the training grounds. A group of operators was practicing vehicle interdictions, the muffled asterisk pop 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 asterisk of suppressed fire echoing off the concrete walls. To the world, this was the pinnacle of military excellence. To Maya, it looked like a stage play where everyone was reading the wrong script. "Where is he?" she asked. "He's not here yet," Thorne said. "He's staging out of a private facility in Amman. He's supposed to join the task force for the final phase of the training in 3 days. The Colonel, Holloway, he's the one who authorized it. He's a process man, Maya. He follows the money, and the money says Vane is an asset." Maya turned back to him. Her face was a mask of controlled stillness. "We aren't here to hunt him, Elias. We're here to protect him while he finishes what he started." Thorne stood up, his eyes wide. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to do my job," Maya said. "I'm going to be the best scout this task force has ever seen. I'm going to stay so close to the process that I can smell the ink on the lies, and when Vane walks through that gate, I'm going to be the first thing he sees." The next 48 hours were a blur of high-intensity evaluation. Task Force 88 was a collection of the most capable, cynical men and women the United States military could assemble. Delta operators, SEALs, Air Force pararescue men, and a handful of specialized NCOs like Maya and Thorne. They were the elite of the elite, and they treated Maya with a distant, professional skepticism. To them, she was the girl who got lucky at the notch, the one who had survived a messy situation through sheer grit rather than refined tradecraft. Maya let them think that. She moved through the training cycles with a quiet, devastating competence that didn't demand attention. On the shooting range, she didn't try to beat the Rangers' times. She simply didn't miss. When they practiced room clearing, she was always the one who noticed the tripwire hidden in the doorframe or the camera tucked into the vent. She didn't say anything. She just cut the wire or masked the lens and moved on. She was waiting for the institutional failure to manifest, and it didn't take long. It happened in the tactical planning room, a high-tech bunker filled with panoramic screens and secure workstations. Colonel Holloway, a man whose uniform was so crisp it looked like it was made of plastic, stood at the head of the table. He was briefing the team on the upcoming mission, a raid on a suspected insurgent supply hub near the Syrian border. "The objective is data recovery," Holloway said, his laser pointer dancing over a satellite map. "We have intel that a series of hard drives containing the location of the northern mineral veins are being moved through this sector. We need a clean snatch and grab. No casualties if possible. We want the drives intact." Maya looked at the map. She recognized the terrain. It was a mirror of the Gambari, steep ridges, narrow funnels, and a single silted-over drainage pipe that led directly to the target building. "Colonel," Maya said. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room like a blade. Holloway paused, his eyebrows arching. "Staff Sergeant Vance, you have something to add." "The target building is a reinforced concrete structure, sir. It has a subterranean level that isn't showing up on your heat maps because of the shale density. If you send the assault team through the front, you're walking into a dead end. The only way in is through the drainage line on the north side." Holloway smiled, a thin, patronizing expression. "We've had the Tier 1 analysts in Virginia look at this for 72 hours, Sergeant. There is no subterranean level. The drainage pipe is blocked by debris. Our consultant has confirmed the layout." "The consultant is wrong, sir," Maya said. She felt the eyes of every operator in the room on her. Thorne, sitting in the back, slowly shook his head, a silent warning. Maya ignored him. "The debris in the pipe is a tactical concealment. It's a baffle. It's designed to look like a blockage on a satellite sweep, but it's a sliding gate. I've seen this configuration before." Holloway's smile vanished. He tapped his pointer against the table. "Sergeant Vance, your experience in the valley was illustrative, but you are here to provide support, not to rewrite the operational plan. Mr. Vane has provided us with ground-level intelligence that contradicts your assessment. He has been in that structure, you have not." "He's lying to you, sir," Maya said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion. The silence that followed was absolute. Holloway stepped toward her, his face reddening. "Are you questioning the integrity of a mission-critical asset, Staff Sergeant? Because if you are, I suggest you do it with more than a feeling about a drainage pipe." "It's not a feeling, sir. It's geometry. Look at the shadows on the eastern wall at 14:00 hours. The way the light bends indicates a void behind the foundation. The building is displaced by 4 degrees to compensate for the weight of the vault below. Holloway didn't even look at the screen. He didn't look at the data. He looked at Maya, and in his eyes, she saw the failure she had been waiting for. It wasn't that he didn't believe her. It was that he didn't care if she was right. He had a mission, he had a timeline, and he had an order from someone higher up the chain to trust the man in the suit. "You're dismissed, Vance," Holloway said. "Go back to the motor pool and check the tire pressure on the Humvees. If you can't be a team player in the TOC, you can be a mechanic." Maya didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She snapped a perfect mechanical salute and walked out of the room. She found Thorne 10 minutes later behind the armory, where the shadows of the water tanks provided a small pocket of privacy. He was leaning against a stack of crates, smoking a cigarette he wasn't supposed to have. "You're a glutton for punishment, you know that?" he said, blowing a cloud of smoke into the dry air. "He's setting them up, Elias," Maya said. She was pacing a small circle in the dirt, her hands clenched at her sides. "The raid isn't about data recovery, it's a clearing operation. Vane wants the U.S. to kill the people holding those drives so he can step in and take them once the smoke clears. He's using the task force as his personal hit squad." Thorne looked at her, his eyes dark. "What are we going to do?" "We aren't going to do anything," Maya said. "I'm going to do something. Holloway wants me in the motor pool. Fine, I'll be in the motor pool, but I'm not checking tire pressure." She spent the next 3 hours in the gut of a heavy transport truck, her hands covered in grease, her mind working through the variables. She knew the task force would move at midnight. She knew the route they would take. And she knew that if she wanted to save them and stop Vane, she had to cross a line she could never uncross. She wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was a woman who knew the truth in a world that was being paid to ignore it. She waited until the base settled into the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of the night shift. She moved through the motor pool like a shadow, her boots making no sound on the oil-slicked concrete. She reached the secure storage locker where the confiscated equipment from the Gambury mission was being held. It was a simple keypad lock, but Maya had watched the supply clerk enter the code 3 times over the last 2 days. The door clicked open. She stepped inside. The air was cool and smelled of ozone. There on the middle shelf was her M4, her plate carrier, and her knife, and next to them in a small, shielded bag was the high-frequency transmitter she had taken from the dead commander at the Notch. She picked it up. The beacon was quiet, its light extinguished, but she knew how to wake it up. She took the transmitter to a workbench in the back of the locker. She pulled a small toolkit from her cargo pocket, a set of precision screwdrivers and a soldering iron she'd scavenged from the comms shop. She began to dismantle the device. The internal circuitry was elegant, a masterpiece of specialized engineering. It wasn't just a beacon, it was a transceiver. It was designed to receive a signal and then amplify it, creating a localized GPS dead zone. Vane wasn't just tracking the task force. He was going to blind them. Maya worked with a terrifying, silent focus. Her fingers moved with a mechanical precision, bypassing the encryption protocols and rewiring the output leads. She wasn't destroying the device. She was repurposing it. She was turning it into a mirror. If Vane sent a signal to blind the task force, the transceiver would now catch that signal and bounce it back to the source. It would point directly at him. She was halfway through the reassembly when the door to the locker creaked open. Maya didn't move. She didn't reach for her knife. She just sat there, the soldering iron still in her hand, as the shadow of a man fell across the workbench. "I figured you'd be here," Thorne said. He was standing in the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked at the dismantled transmitter, then at Maya. "That's a court-martial, Maya. That's 10 years in Leavenworth if they catch you." "They won't catch me," Maya said. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the circuit board. "Unless you tell them." Thorne walked into the room and closed the door behind him. He sat on a crate next to the workbench. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just watched her work, the glow of the soldering iron reflecting in his eyes. "I saw my mom last month," Thorne said suddenly. His voice was soft, distant. "Before I shipped out. She's getting old, Maya. She's living in that house in Ohio, and she's still waiting for my dad to come home from a war that ended 20 years ago. She looks at me and she doesn't see a soldier. She sees a ghost." Maya paused, the iron hovering over a contact point. "I don't want to be a ghost, Maya," Thorne whispered. "I don't want to die for a lithium mine. I don't want to die because some guy in a suit decided I was expendable." Maya looked at him then. She saw the fear he had been hiding since the Notch. She saw the cost of his loyalty. "You aren't going to die, Elias," Maya said. "Not tonight, not on my watch." "Then let me help," he said. He reached out and picked up a pair of wire strippers. "Tell me what needs to be done." They worked together in the dark for another hour. It was a silent, desperate partnership, a shared secret that felt like a blood oath. Thorne handled the casing and the power supply while Maya finished the delicate logic gates. When they were done, the transmitter looked exactly as it had when they found it, but its heart had been changed. Maya tucked the device into a hidden compartment in her plate carrier. She looked at Thorne. "Go back to your bunk, Elias. If things go wrong, I need you to be the one who wasn't there. I need you to be the one who tells the story." "I'm not leaving you, Maya." "Yes, you are," she said, her voice a bar of iron. "Because if we both go down, Vane wins. You're my overwatch, Elias, not on the ridge, in the report." Thorne looked at her for a long, long time. He reached out and squeezed her hand, his grip crushing and brief. "Stay alive, Staff Sergeant." "That's an order," she said. Thorne vanished into the night, leaving Maya alone in the locker. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of metal and cold. She knew what she had to do next. She had to get on that transport. She had to be in the valley when the world turned gray. She walked back to the motor pool and found the lead transport truck, a massive armored beast that was idling in the staging area. The driver was a young specialist named Miller, a kid who spent most of his time reading comic books and complaining about the heat. "Vance," Miller asked, looking up from his phone as Maya climbed into the passenger seat. "I thought the colonel told you to stay back and check the fleet." "I did," Maya said. She didn't look at him. She stared at the dark horizon. "The fleet is fine, but this truck has a vibration in the front axle. I'm coming along to monitor it. Colonel's orders." Miller shrugged. He didn't care about the chain of command as long as he didn't have to do the work himself. "Whatever you say, Sarge. We're rolling in 5. The convoy left at 00:30 hours. 6 vehicles, 35 men, and $1 million worth of technology, all headed toward a trap that only one woman in the world could see. The drive was long and silent. The Jordanian desert was a monochromatic landscape of silver and black under the moon. Maya sat in the cab, her hand resting on the hidden transmitter in her vest. She could feel the vibration of the truck, the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the sand. It felt like a countdown. They reached the target sector 2 hours later. The building was exactly where the satellite had promised, a squat, ugly structure of concrete and rebar sitting in the middle of a dry lake bed. It looked abandoned, a relic of a forgotten war. Holloway's voice came over the radio, sounding sharp and expectant. "Element 1, move to the primary entry point. Element 2, establish overwatch on the ridge. We have green light for engagement. Secure the drives." Maya watched as the operators spilled out of the trucks. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, their NVGs glowing green in the dark. They were the best in the world, and they were walking straight into the funnel. "Miller, stay with the truck," Maya said. "You got it, Sarge." Maya stepped out into the night. The air was cold now, a biting chill that reminded her of the ranch. She didn't follow the assault team. She moved toward the north side of the building, toward the drainage pipe that Holloway said didn't exist. She found it under a pile of rusted corrugated metal and sun-bleached tires. It was a 3-foot-wide concrete tube, its opening choked with debris. Maya reached into the opening and felt around the rim. There, a recessed lever coated in grit. She pulled it. The blockage didn't move, but a small, rectangular section of the concrete wall next to the pipe slid back with a hiss of hydraulics. It was a keypad. Maya didn't have the code. She didn't need it. She pulled the transmitter from her vest and held it against the keypad. She pressed the activation switch. The device hummed, a low-frequency vibration that made the hair on her arms stand up. For a second, nothing happened. And then the keypad flickered. The red light turned green. The sliding gate groaned and began to retract. Maya drew her M4 and stepped into the tunnel. It was a narrow, low-ceilinged passage that smelled of damp earth and old grease. She moved with her back against the wall, her rifle leading the way. The tunnel sloped downward, deeper into the foundation of the building. She reached the end of the passage and found herself on a steel catwalk overlooking a vast, subterranean chamber. It wasn't a supply hub. It was a data center. Rows of server racks hummed in the dark, their blue and amber lights blinking in a frantic digital rhythm. In the center of the room was a large, glass-walled office. And inside the office, sitting at a mahogany desk that looked like it had been stolen from a law firm in D.C., was Julian Vane. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing tactical gear, clean, expensive, and black. He was looking at a bank of monitors, his face illuminated by the cold light of the screens. He was watching the task force. He was watching them enter the building through the front door. Maya didn't breathe. She watched as Vane reached for a console on his desk. He pressed a button. On the monitors, the task force's video feeds suddenly dissolved into static. The radio chatter in Maya's ear turned into a high-pitched scream of white noise. They were blind. Vane picked up a headset. Team B, engage. Frontal entry is neutralized. Sweep the lobby and take them down. I want the officers alive. The rest are expendable. Maya felt the rage then. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger. It was a cold, surgical fire. She looked at the man who had ordered the death of her friends, the man who was using her country's flag as a shroud for his own greed. She stepped onto the catwalk. The metal groaned. Vane froze. He didn't turn around immediately. He was a professional. He knew the sound of a threat. "You're early," Vane said, his voice smooth and untroubled. "The extraction team isn't supposed to be here for another 20 minutes. "I'm not the extraction team," Maya said. Vane turned then. He looked at Maya standing on the catwalk with her rifle leveled at his chest. He didn't look surprised. He looked intrigued. "Staff Sergeant Vance," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The hero of the Gamboree. I must say I didn't expect you to find the back door. Holloway said you were difficult. I didn't realize you were resourceful." "Holloway is a fool," Maya said. "And you're a traitor." Vane laughed, a short, dry sound. "Traitor? To what, Sergeant?" "To a government that is currently paying me $5 million to consult on this mission. To an army that would have let you rot in Wyoming if they didn't need someone to pull a trigger. Don't be naive. There are no flags here, only interests." "I have an interest," Maya said. She stepped closer, the muzzle of her rifle steady on his forehead. "I have an interest in making sure you never leave this hole." Vane sighed. He reached for a small silver remote on his desk. "A noble sentiment, but unfortunately I have the remote. In about 10 seconds, the demolition charges in the lobby are going to detonate. Your friends, Thorne, isn't it? The skinny one. They are going to be buried under 3 stories of concrete unless you put that rifle down and help me finish the download." Maya felt the air in her lungs turn to ice. Thorne was in the building. He hadn't stayed at the base. He had followed her. He had joined the assault team to cover her. "You're lying," Maya said. "Am I? Check your radio. Oh, wait, you can't. I've jammed the frequency." Vane smiled, a shark-like grin. "It's a simple choice, Maya. You can kill me and watch your friends die, or you can help me and I'll give them the code to the exit." Maya looked at the monitors. She saw the static. She saw the flickering lights of the demolition charges in the corners of the lobby. She looked at Vane. She knew he was lying about the exit. He would kill them all the moment the download was complete. But she also knew she couldn't reach the lobby in time to stop the charges. She had one move left. The variable he didn't know about. She reached into her vest and pulled out the transmitter. Vane's eyes widened. "Where did you get that?" "I took it from your man at the Notch," Maya said. "The one you abandoned." "It's dead," Vane snapped. "The encryption is unbreakable." "I didn't break the encryption," Maya said. "I changed the frequency." She pressed the activation switch on the device. The room was suddenly filled with a deafening, rhythmic pulsing sound, a digital heartbeat that seemed to shake the very walls. On Vane's desk, the monitors began to flicker and die. The server racks behind him let out a chorus of high-pitched whines, and then one by one they began to smoke. "What did you do?" Vane screamed, jumping to his feet. "That's the core. You're frying the core." "I'm not frying the core," Maya said. "I'm bouncing your jamming signal back into your own hardware. The transceiver is acting as a loop. You aren't blinding the task force anymore, Vane. You're blinding yourself." On the wall behind Vane, the radio speaker crackled to life. "Is Element 1, we have visual. The jamming is down. We have contact in the basement. Move, move, move." It was Holloway's voice, but it was followed by a sound that made Maya's heart skip a beat. "Vance, Maya, if you can hear me, we're coming." "Thorne." Vane looked at the door, then back at Maya. His face was no longer smooth. It was a mask of frantic, cornered rage. He reached for a pistol hidden under his desk. Maya didn't fire her rifle. She didn't want to make the noise. She lunged over the desk. They hit the floor together, a tangle of limbs and gear. Vane was fast, but he was a man who used technology to fight his battles. Maya was a woman who had been forged in the dirt and the wind. She slammed her elbow into his jaw, the bone cracking under the impact. He groaned and tried to roll, his hand finding a combat knife on his belt. He slashed at her, the blade catching her across the shoulder, a shallow, stinging cut. Maya didn't flinch. She grabbed his wrist, her fingers finding the pressure point she had practiced 1,000 times in the dark behind the motor pool. She twisted and the knife clattered to the floor. She was on top of him then, her forearm pressed against his throat. "The codes," she hissed. Give me the codes for the charges. Go to hell, Vane wheezed, his eyes bulging. Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, blackened pin from the flashbang, the one she had kept since the notch. She held it an inch from his eye. I've lived in the dark my whole life, Julian, Maya said, her voice a terrifying, quiet whisper. You don't want to see what happens when I lose my patience. Vane looked at the pin. He looked at the woman holding it. He saw the dark competence in her eyes, the specific, lethal stillness of someone who had nothing left to lose. Under the keyboard, he gasped. The red tab, it's a proximity override. Maya didn't let go of his throat. She reached up with her free hand and found the keyboard. She pulled the red tab. On the monitors, the red lights in the lobby turned green. A second later, the glass wall of the office shattered into 1,000 glittering shards. Thorne was the first through the door, his rifle raised, his face covered in dust and sweat. He was followed by 4 Delta operators, their movements a blur of synchronized violence. They saw Maya on the floor, her hands around Vane's throat. Vance, Thorne shouted. Maya didn't move, she didn't look up. She waited until the operators had secured the room, until Vane was handcuffed and dragged to his feet. Only then did she stand up. She was covered in blood, Vane's and her own. Her uniform was torn and her side was aching with a dull, throbbing heat. She looked at Thorne. He didn't say a word. He just walked over to her and put his hand on her shoulder. It was the same grip he had used at the notch, steady and fierce. You did it, he whispered. We did it, Maya said. Colonel Holloway walked into the room a minute later. He looked at the smoking servers, the captive Vane, and the 2 soldiers standing in the center of the wreckage. He looked at Maya, and for the first time, he didn't look like a man of process. He looked like a man who was seeing something for the very first time. Sergeant Vance, Holloway said. He hesitated, his hand reaching for his cap. The report, it's going to be complicated. I don't care about the report, sir, Maya said. She wiped a smudge of blood from her cheek. I care about the mission, and the mission is complete. She walked past him out of the office and through the smoke-filled data center. She didn't wait for the commendation. She didn't wait for the apology. She walked toward the exit, toward the light of the approaching dawn. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she felt a sudden, sharp vibration in her pocket. It was the transmitter. She pulled it out. The light was no longer green. It was blue. A new signal. A signal that wasn't coming from the building. It was coming from the base. Maya stopped. She looked at the blue light, a cold, rhythmic pulse that seemed to match the beat of her own heart. The download hadn't been to Vane's servers. It had been an upload, and the target wasn't the task force. It was the Pentagon. Maya looked back at the smoke-filled room, at the men who thought they had won. She looked at the blue light, and she knew that the cost of being right was about to get much, much higher. She turned and started to run. Thorne, she screamed. Thorne, get out, it's not over. The building behind her let out a low, bass-heavy groan, and then the world disappeared into a roar of fire and falling stone. Maya felt the floor drop out from under her. She felt the weight of the mountain beginning to settle, and as she fell into the darkness, she had one final thought. The mission wasn't complete. It was just getting started. The dust in Maya Vance's lungs tasted like pulverized history, a gritty mixture of Jordanian limestone and the charred silicon of the servers she had just tried and failed to save. It was a thick, suffocating gray that didn't just hang in the air. It claimed it, turning the oxygen into something heavy and abrasive. For a long, terrifying minute, there was no sound, only the high, crystalline ringing in her ears, a byproduct of the concussive force that had just tried to flatten her into the foundation of the earth. She lay on her side, her cheek pressed against concrete that was still radiating the unnatural heat of the blast. Her vision was a blurred kaleidoscope of orange embers and deep, suffocating shadows. She tried to draw a breath, and the effort sent a jagged spike of agony through her ribs, a reminder that the rebar wound from the gambari wasn't the only thing trying to break her tonight. She didn't move. She waited for the world to stop spinning, for the internal architecture of her mind to reassemble the map of the room. This was her gift, the thing the Army had never quite known how to categorize in her file. Where others saw a room, Maya saw a series of vectors, load-bearing stresses and thermal gradients. Even now, through the haze of a concussion, she could feel the geometry of the collapse. The ceiling hadn't entirely pancaked. It had tented, caught on the reinforced pillars of the server vault. She was in a triangular pocket of survival, roughly 8 feet wide and 4 feet high. The silence was finally broken by a sound that made her blood run colder than the desert night, the rhythmic, wet cough of a man struggling for air. "Thorne," she whispered. The word felt like it was made of glass. She forced herself up. Her left arm was numb, a dead weight at her side, and her shoulder screamed where Vane's knife had carved its mark. She ignored it. She crawled through the wreckage, her hands searching through the debris. The floor was littered with the remains of the glass office, shards so fine they felt like sand. She found a boot first, then a leg. Thorne was half buried under a section of the steel catwalk. The weight was pinning his chest, his face pale under a mask of gray soot. His eyes were open, but they were unfocused, tracking something only he could see in the dark. "Elias, look at me," Maya commanded, her voice regaining its iron core. She reached him, her fingers searching for his carotid. His pulse was fast, thready. "Stay with me. You're not dying in a hole in Jordan. We talked about this." Thorne's hand came up, grasping her forearm with a strength that surprised her. The charges," he wheezed. "Vane." "The charges didn't take the whole building," Maya said, her mind already calculating the structural integrity of the remaining vault. He was precise. He didn't want to destroy the data. He wanted to bury the witnesses. He's still out there, Elias, and he's not alone. She looked at the transmitter she was still clutching. The blue light was no longer pulsing. It was a steady, eerie glow. It wasn't a beacon anymore. It was a confirmation. The poison pill had been delivered. Vane hadn't just stolen data. He had used the task force's own secure uplink to inject a corrupted protocol into the regional command and control net. Somewhere in a basement in Virginia, a light was turning red, and they would think it was the task force's fault. They would think Maya had turned. She shifted her weight, bracing her boots against a fallen server rack and her back against the steel beam pinning Thorne. This was the moment of maximum pressure. The weight was several hundred pounds, well beyond her physical limit. But Maya didn't think about the weight. She thought about the geometry. She saw the fulcrum. She saw the point where the beam was balanced on a piece of shattered masonry. She let out a slow, controlled breath the way she did before a long-range shot. She felt the lines of force in her own body, aligning her spine, her hips, her legs into a single, unyielding pillar. "On 3, she rasped. "You crawl, don't think, just move." She didn't count, she just pushed. It wasn't a human movement, it was a mechanical one. For a heartbeat, her vision went white, the pain in her ribs exploding into a blinding supernova. She felt the skin on her palms tear as they gripped the rusted steel. The beam groaned, a long, protesting shriek of metal on metal. It shifted an inch, 2 inches. Thorne scrambled backward, his movements clumsy and desperate. As soon as he was clear, Maya let the weight drop. The impact shook the floor, sending a new cloud of dust into the air. She collapsed beside him, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her chest like a trapped bird. They lay there in the dark for a moment, 2 ghosts in a tomb. You're not normal, Vance," Thorne managed, his voice a ragged shadow of itself. "I'm a scout," she said, her voice flat. "We find the way out, that's the job." But as she reached for her M4, she heard it, the sound of boots on the stairs. Not the heavy, rhythmic stomp of the task force, but the light, deliberate tread of professionals who weren't in a hurry. Vane's Team B, the extraction team, they were coming down to confirm the kills. Maya looked at Thorne. He couldn't stand, not yet. His ribs were likely broken, and he was concussed. She looked at her rifle. It was jammed with grit, the bolt stuck halfway back. She dropped it. She pulled her combat knife, the one she had taken from the dead insurgent at the notch, and felt the familiar weight of the blackened steel. "Stay quiet," she whispered to Thorne. "Don't breathe unless you have to." She moved into the shadows. This was her hidden capability at its most lethal. In the dark, Maya Vance didn't just see, she felt the displacement of air. She felt the vibration of footsteps. She became a part of the architecture. 2 men entered the vault. They were wearing high-end night vision, their silhouettes ghost-like in the green glow of their own optics. They moved with a casual arrogance, their suppressed submachine guns sweeping the rubble. "Clear right," one whispered. "Check the office area. Vane said the girl might have survived. She's a cockroach." Maya was 6 feet away, flattened against a pillar that shouldn't have been able to hide a woman of her height. But she knew the angle of their optics. She knew the blind spots created by the flickering blue light of the transmitter. She waited until the first man passed her. She didn't go for his throat, not yet. She reached out and touched the side of a leaning server rack. One light push at the exact stress point she had identified. The rack tipped. It wasn't a loud crash, just a heavy metallic thud that drew both men's attention to the left. In that heartbeat of distraction, Maya moved. She was a blur of gray and black. She hit the second man from the side, her knife finding the gap between his helmet and his plate carrier. It was a surgical strike, quick, silent, and final. He went down without a sound, his rifle clattering softly against his chest. The first man spun around, his weapon coming up. But Maya wasn't where he expected her to be. She had already dropped to the floor, rolling through the glass shards. She came up under his guard, her shoulder slamming into his solar plexus. He wheezed, his finger tightening on the trigger, but she grabbed the barrel of the gun, redirecting the burst of fire into the concrete floor. The sparks illuminated her face for a fraction of a second, a mask of cold, unblinking focus. She twisted the weapon out of his hands and drove her knee into his thigh, deadening the nerve. As he buckled, she finished it with a precise strike to the temple. The room returned to silence. Maya stood over the bodies, her chest heaving, the blood from her shoulder dripping onto the floor. She didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel the rush of adrenaline. She felt the cost. Every movement was a withdrawal from a bank account that was nearing zero. Her body was a collection of alarms, all of them screaming for her to stop, to lie down, to let the darkness take her. She walked back to Thorne. He was sitting up now, holding a handgun he'd pulled from one of the fallen mercenaries. His eyes were wide, reflecting the blue glow of the transmitter. "Maya," he said, his voice trembling. "The light, it's changing again." She looked down. The transmitter was no longer blue. It was a deep, pulsating violet. "It's not an upload," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "It's a handshake." Vane hadn't just sent a virus. He had opened a back door. The regional command and control net wasn't just being corrupted, it was being hijacked. Every drone, every secure comms line, every satellite feed in the sector was being rerouted through this basement. And the handshake was coming from somewhere outside Jordan, somewhere with a lot of power. "We have to go," Maya said. She grabbed Thorne's arm, hauling him to his feet. He groaned, his face contorting in pain, but he leaned into her. "Where?" "The motor pool. If Miller stayed with the truck, we might have a chance." They began the long, agonizing climb out of the tomb. Every step was a battle. The drainage tunnel was half collapsed, the air thick with the smell of leaking fuel and ozone. Maya led the way, her spatial synesthesia guiding her through the unstable geometry of the debris. She knew exactly which stone would hold their weight and which would trigger a secondary collapse. They emerged into the night air 20 minutes later. The desert was a shock, cold, vast, and indifferent. The building behind them was a jagged tooth of broken concrete, smoke curling from its wounds like incense. In the distance, Maya could see the lights of the task force vehicles. They were regrouping on the ridge, unaware that the world they served had just been sold out from under them. And then she saw the truck. It was sitting exactly where they had left it, its engine idling, its headlights cutting through the dust. Miller was standing by the driver's side door, his hands in the air. Standing in front of him, silhouetted by the headlights, was Julian Vane. He looked immaculate despite the chaos. He was holding a satellite phone to his ear, his back to the ruins. He didn't see Maya and Thorne approaching through the shadows of the water tanks. "Yes, the handshake is complete," Vane was saying, his voice clear and professional. "The protocol is embedded. You can initiate the sequence on my mark. And Holloway, he's a non-issue. He'll be too busy explaining why he lost a Tier 1 team to notice the data drift." Maya stopped 10 yards away. She could feel the vibration of the truck's engine in the soles of her boots. She looked at Thorne. He was barely holding on, his weight sagging against her. "Elias," she whispered, "give me the pistol." "Maya, you can't." "Give me the pistol." He handed it to her. It was a Sig Sauer P320, heavy and cold. She checked the chamber by feel, 1 round in the pipe, 17 in the mag. She stepped out of the shadows. "Vane," she said. The man didn't jump. He didn't even drop the phone. He slowly turned around, a look of mild disappointment crossing his face. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "you really are remarkably persistent. It's a trait that will serve you poorly in the coming months." "Hang up the phone," Maya said. Vane looked at the phone, then back at her. He smiled. "I'm afraid I can't do that. The sequence has already started. In about 10 minutes, the U.S. Fifth Fleet's tactical network is going to experience a synaptic failure. It will look like a solar flare or perhaps a localized cyber attack from the usual suspects. By the time they fix it, the mineral rights for the entire Gambari corridor will have been legally transferred to a private consortium." "The people you killed," Maya said, her voice trembling with a rage she could no longer control. "The men at the notch, the soldiers in this building, they weren't mineral rights, they were Americans." "They were costs," Maya, Vane said, stepping toward her. "Just like you, you're a cost the army is no longer willing to pay. Look at yourself. You're bleeding, you're broken, and you're holding a weapon against a man who is legally authorized to be here. What do you think happens next?" "I don't think," Maya said. She raised the pistol. At that moment, the sky above them was torn apart. A pair of F-15s screamed overhead, their afterburners lighting up the desert like twin suns. The sound was a physical assault, a roar that shook the earth and drowned out everything else. Vane looked up, his eyes widening. For the first time, he looked afraid. "What is that?" he shouted over the noise. Maya didn't answer. She knew what it was. It was the handshake. The synaptic failure had already begun. The jets were flying blind, their navigation system scrambled by the protocol Vane had just unleashed. One of the jets banked sharply, its wing dipping dangerously low to the ground. It was a terrifying sight, $100 million machine losing its mind in real time. "Miller, get in the truck!" Maya screamed. She didn't fire at Vane. She didn't have to. The jet's wing clipped the top of the ridge, sending a shower of sparks and debris into the lakebed. The shockwave knocked Vane to his knees. The satellite phone flew from his hand, shattering against the concrete. Maya grabbed Thorne and shoved him toward the truck. Miller was already in the driver's seat, his face white with terror. "Go now," Maya shouted. She scrambled into the back of the truck just as Miller floored it. The heavy vehicle lurched forward, its tires spinning in the sand. Maya looked back and saw Vane standing in the dust, his hands reaching for the broken pieces of his phone. He looked small. He looked like a man who had tried to play God and realized he was only a ghost. The drive back to the base was a nightmare of flickering lights and screaming radios. The entire sector was in chaos. The GPS was down, the encrypted channels were filled with static, and the very air seemed to hum with the violet energy of the hijacked network. Thorne was drifting in and out of consciousness in the back of the truck. Maya sat beside him, her hand pressed against his chest, her other hand clutching the transmitter. The device was burning hot now. The violet light was so bright it was blinding. She looked at the screen of the transmitter. It was no longer showing coordinates. It was showing a countdown. Asterisk 0459, 0458. Asterisk the poison pill wasn't just a backdoor, it was a self-destruct. Vane's masters weren't just stealing the data, they were erasing the evidence, and the evidence was the task force's entire digital footprint. "Miller, how far to the gate?" Maya shouted. 3 miles, but the comms are dead, Sarge. They won't let us in." "They'll let us in," Maya said. She stood up in the bed of the truck, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She looked at the base, the King Abdullah Roman II training center. It was a fortress in the dark, its perimeter lights flickering as the power grid struggled. She saw the gate. She saw the heavy machine gun nests. She saw the soldiers with their weapons leveled at the approaching truck. She didn't stop. She didn't slow down. She took the transmitter and held it high above her head. "Don't fire," she screamed, though she knew they couldn't hear her. The countdown hit asterisk 0100 asterisk. The transmitter let out a high-pitched whine, a sound that pierced through the roar of the truck and the scream of the jets. The violet light expanded, a dome of energy that seemed to swallow the truck. And then the world went white. It wasn't an explosion of fire. It was an explosion of information. Maya felt her mind being flooded with 1 billion data points, satellite feeds, mission logs, personnel files, mineral maps. She saw the Gambury. She saw the Notch. She saw the face of every man she had ever served with. It was the ultimate spatial synesthesia, a map of the entire war laid out in a single, devastating moment. She saw the truth. The war wasn't about lithium. It wasn't about minerals. It was about the data itself. The lithium was the lure. The real prize was the U.S. military's neural network, the collective intelligence of 20 years of combat. Vane wasn't a consultant for a mining company. He was a broker for a rival intelligence agency, and she was the only one who had seen the handshake. The truck slammed into the gate at 40 miles an hour. The barrier crumbled, the metal groaning as the heavy transport plowed through. Maya was thrown forward, her head hitting the cab. Darkness claimed her then. A different kind of darkness, not the tomb of the vault, but the quiet, empty space of a mind that had seen too much. She woke up on the asphalt of the motor pool. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. The air was silent now. No jets. No radios, only the sound of boots on concrete. Maya tried to move, but her body was a lead weight. She looked to her left. Thorne was being loaded onto a stretcher by a team of medics. He was pale, but his eyes were open. He looked at her, and for a second a small, weary smile touched his lips. "Maya," he mouthed. She tried to reach for him, but a hand caught her shoulder. It was Holloway. The colonel looked like he had aged 10 years in a single night. His uniform was stained with sweat and dust, and his eyes were red-rimmed. He was holding the transmitter in his hand. It was a blackened, melted piece of plastic now. "Staff Sergeant Vance," he said. His voice was a rasp. Maya looked at him. She didn't salute. She didn't move. "The Fifth Fleet is dark," Holloway whispered. The entire regional net is gone. They're calling it a catastrophic system failure. It wasn't a failure, sir, Maya said, her voice a hollow echo. It was a heist. Holloway looked at the melted device, then back at her. There's no evidence of a heist, Vance. There's only a building that blew up under your watch, a consultant who is missing, and a staff sergeant who was found in a stolen truck with a fried piece of unauthorized hardware. Maya felt the air in her lungs turn to ice. The institutional reckoning hadn't started yet, but she could see the shape of it. She could see the walls closing in. I have the data, sir, she said. Holloway tilted his head. What data? In here, Maya said, touching her temple. The handshake, I saw it. I saw the protocols. I saw where the signal was going. Holloway stared at her for a long time. In his eyes, Maya saw a flicker of something, not belief, but fear. The fear of a man who realized he was standing in the presence of something he couldn't control. You're concussed, Vance, Holloway said, his voice regaining its bureaucratic edge. You're dehydrated and you're suffering from extreme combat stress. You're going to the infirmary, and then you're going into a secure holding cell until the investigators from D.C. arrive. Sir, that's an order, Sergeant. Holloway turned and walked away, his boots clicking on the asphalt. Maya lay there on the ground, the cold concrete pressing against her back. She watched the sun rise over the Jordanian desert. It was a beautiful morning, clear, bright, and indifferent to the wreckage of the night. She felt the cost then, the full, crushing weight of it. She had saved Thorne. She had stopped the poison pill from completing its final cycle. She had seen the truth, and for that she would be destroyed. She looked at her hands. They were covered in grease, blood, and the fine gray dust of the gambary. She closed them into fists. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a ghost. She was a scout. And as the medics approached her with a stretcher, Maya Vance felt a small, quiet spark of hope. It was a dangerous thing, a tiny flame in a world of ice. But it was alive. She knew the protocol. She knew the handshake. And she knew that before this was over, Julian Vane was going to realize that the most dangerous thing in the world wasn't a hijacked network. It was a woman who knew exactly what she was capable of. The medics lifted her onto the stretcher. The world tilted, the sky spinning above her. Maya closed her eyes, letting the darkness take her one last time. But as she drifted away, she didn't think about the prison or the court-martial. She thought about the geometry of the return. She would find a way back. She always did. The reckoning was coming, but it wasn't just coming for her. It was coming for all of them. The fluorescent lights of the intensive care ward at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center didn't flicker, but to Maya Vance, they hummed in a specific, agonizing frequency that sounded like the afterglow of the violet handshake. It was a sterile, unforgiving white that smelled of industrial-grade bleach and the metallic tang of blood that no amount of scrubbing could ever truly remove from the subconscious. She was strapped into a high-backed bed, her left arm immobilized in a heavy sling, her ribs wrapped so tight she felt like she was wearing a corset made of iron. Every breath was a calculated risk. Every heartbeat was a drum echoing against the hollow architecture of her own exhaustion. She had been in Germany for 48 hours, though time had ceased to be a linear concept and had become a series of sensory intrusions. The prick of an Roman 4 needle, the rhythmic hiss of a blood pressure cuff, the distant, muffled sound of a C-17 Globemaster taking off from the flight line, its engines a low-frequency vibration that rattled the loose molar in the back of her jaw. She was under medical hold, which was the Pentagon's polite way of saying she was in a cage that happened to have a heart monitor. The door to her room didn't open. It was operated. The heavy magnetic lock clicked, a sharp, mechanical sound that Maya felt in her teeth, and two men in class, a uniform, stepped inside. They didn't look like doctors. They had the posture of men who spent their lives in windowless rooms in Northern Virginia, their faces scrubbed of any discernible human emotion. One was a colonel she didn't recognize, his chest a crowded garden of ribbons that spoke of decades of bureaucratic survival. The other was younger, a captain with a JAG insignia on his lapel, and a digital recorder in his hand that he placed on the rolling tray table as if it were a ceremonial dagger. Staff Sergeant Vance, the colonel said. He didn't offer his name. Names were for people who intended to stay. I'm Colonel Reed. This is Captain Miller from the Trial Defense Service. You've been read your rights. I have, Maya said. Her voice was a dry rasp, the sound of boots on gravel. We've reviewed the preliminary report from Colonel Holloway, Reed continued, stepping closer. He didn't sit. Sitting would imply a conversation. This was a deposition. It's a troubling document, Sergeant. It describes an unauthorized departure from your post, the theft of a command vehicle, the destruction of a multi-million-dollar sensitive compartmented information facility, and the loss of a civilian contractor who was under the protection of the United States Army. Maya watched him. She didn't blink. Her gift, the spatial synesthesia that allowed her to see the hidden geometry of the world, was currently focused on the way Reed leaned his weight slightly on his right leg. He had a lower back injury, likely old, and it made him impatient. He wanted this over. He wanted her to be the neat, tidy explanation for a catastrophe that he couldn't otherwise justify to the Oversight Committee. Julian Vane was not a contractor, Maya said, her voice steady despite the fire in her lungs. He was a breach. He initiated a handshake protocol that compromised the Fifth Fleet's tactical net. I didn't destroy the SIF. The protocol triggered a thermal purge of the server racks to cover the data exfiltration. Reed exchanged a glance with the JAG officer. It was a look of practiced pity. Sergeant, the technical teams have spent the last 36 hours forensic mapping the remains of that facility. The captain said, his voice soft, the way one speaks to a wounded animal that might still bite. There is no evidence of a handshake. There is no evidence of a thermal purge. The servers were destroyed by a localized explosive charge, specifically a C4 derivative that matches the demolition kits issued to your task force. Your fingerprints were on the remaining fragments of the transmitter. Because I took it from Vane, Maya said. Vane is gone, Sergeant, Reed snapped. The Jordanian authorities found his vehicle abandoned 12 miles from the border. He's disappeared, and he left behind a trail of digital breadcrumbs that point directly to a series of encrypted communications sent from your personal terminal in the weeks leading up to the Gambury incident. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. This was the institutional response. It wasn't about finding the truth, it was about the architecture of the blame. They had already built the scaffold. They were just waiting for her to climb the stairs. They were turning her extraordinary capability, her ability to see the connections others missed, into the very evidence of her treason. If she could see the patterns, then she must have been the one who drew them. I didn't send those messages, Maya said. She felt a cold, hard knot of rage forming in her stomach, but she kept it behind her eyes. Vane had access to the entire net. He used my credentials because he knew I was the only one looking at the Gambury corridor for what it actually was. And what was it, Sergeant? Reed asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A conspiracy? A shadow war? A marketplace, Maya said. He wasn't selling minerals, he was selling the network itself. The lithium was just the bait to get the task force to build the infrastructure. Once the towers were up and the secure uplinks were active, he handed the keys to a third party. Reed leaned down, his face inches from hers. She could smell the coffee and the stale peppermint on his breath. You are a scout, Vance. You are a high-performing soldier with a history of unorthodox problem-solving. But you are also a woman who has been under immense combat stress for 3 consecutive tours. The doctors call it hypervigilant projection. You see threats where there are none because you don't know how to exist in a world that isn't trying to kill you. He straightened up, smoothing his tunic. The Army is willing to consider a plea, a medical discharge, total loss of benefits but no Leavenworth. You sign a statement admitting that you suffered a psychological break in the vault, that you hallucinated the involvement of Mr. Vane, and that your actions were the result of untreated PTSD. We bury the embarrassment, and you go home to Montana. Maya looked at the ceiling. She thought about the violet light. She thought about the way the F-15s had screamed overhead, flying blind in a sky that had been stolen from them. If she signed that paper, the handshake would remain active. The back door Vane had opened would stay open, a silent, invisible wound in the nation's defense that would bleed out one bite at a time until there was nothing left. No, Maya said. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic beep of her heart monitor. You're making a mistake, Sergeant, the JAG captain said. The mistake was thinking you could buy me with a plane ticket to Billings, Maya said. I'm not crazy, and I'm not a traitor. I'm the only one who knows the frequency of the handshake, and until you realize that, the Fifth Fleet is sailing with a target on its back. Reed didn't argue. He didn't try to convince her. He simply nodded to the captain, who picked up the recorder and turned it off. Transfer her, Reed said. Level 4 security, no visitors, no phone calls. She's no longer a patient. She's a national security asset under investigation. They walked out, the magnetic lock clicking shut behind them. Maya lay in the silence, her heart hammering against her broken ribs. She was alone. She was broken. She was being erased. But as she closed her eyes, the geometry returned. She didn't see the hospital room. She saw the map. She saw the data drift. She saw the one thing they couldn't take away from her. She knew where Vane was going. The transport happened at 3 in the morning. They didn't use an ambulance. They used a blacked-out Chevy Suburban with tinted windows and a driver who wore a suit and an earpiece. Maya was dressed in a standard-issue gray tracksuit, her arms still in the sling, her feet in thin hospital slippers. They didn't handcuff her to the seat, but a man sat on either side of her, their shoulders pressing against hers, a physical reminder of her new status. They drove through the back gates of Ramstein, bypassing the main terminal where the families of returning soldiers were waiting with "Welcome Home" signs. Maya watched the lights of the base fade into the distance. She felt the weight of the institution settling onto her, a vast, grinding machine designed to protect itself at all costs. She was a grain of sand in the gears, and the machine was currently trying to decide whether to spit her out or crush her into dust. They arrived at a nondescript hangar on the far side of the flight line. A Gulfstream with no markings was waiting, its engines whining in the cold German night. As they led her toward the air stairs, she saw a figure standing in the shadow of the hangar. He was sitting in a wheelchair, a thick blanket draped over his legs, a nasal cannula providing him with a steady stream of oxygen. Thorn. Maya stopped. The guards tried to nudge her forward, but she planted her feet. Her ribs screamed in protest, but she didn't move. "Elias," she called out. Thorn turned his head slowly. His face was a map of bruises, his eyes sunken and tired. He looked like a man who had been through a war and lost everything except his breath. He looked at her, and for a moment the vacancy in his eyes vanished. He saw her, really saw her. "Vance," he mouthed. He didn't have the strength to shout. One of the guards placed a hand on Maya's shoulder, a firm, warning pressure. "Keep moving, Sergeant." "What did you do to him?" Maya asked, her voice low and dangerous. "Corporal Thorn is being repatriated for long-term rehabilitation," the guard said, his voice a mechanical drone. "His injuries are extensive. He will not be fit for duty again." Maya looked back at Thorn. She saw the way he was holding his hands, clenched tight in his lap. He was a ranger. He was a man who lived for the mission, for the brotherhood of the team. And now he was being discarded, a broken tool that was no longer useful to the craftsmen. It was the ultimate cost of loyalty. He had followed her into that vault. He had believed her when no one else would. And for that, the army was sending him to a VA hospital in the middle of nowhere to be forgotten. Thorn raised one hand, a slow, trembling gesture. He tapped his temple, then pointed at her. Asterisk, "I remember." Asterisk, the guard shoved Maya forward, and this time she didn't resist. She climbed the stairs into the belly of the plane, the cold wind whipping her hair across her face. As the door hissed shut, she felt a piece of her heart break, a small, sharp fracture that hurt worse than her ribs. Thorn was the only one who knew the truth, and they were silencing him with care. The flight to the States was a blur of high-altitude turbulence and the smell of recycled air. Maya didn't sleep. She spent the hours mapping the handshake in her mind. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing, a complex, self-evolving code that used the military's own encryption protocols as a camouflage. Vane hadn't just stolen data, he had created a parasite. And as she sat in the dim light of the cabin, Maya realized that the handshake wasn't just a back door. It was a beacon. It was still communicating. Every few minutes she felt a phantom itch at the back of her brain, a rhythmic pulse that coincided with the plane's satellite uplink. Her synesthesia was picking up the interference, translating the digital signal into a physical sensation. The poison pill hadn't been fully neutralized. It was dormant, waiting for a final command, and she was the only receiver left in the world that could feel it. They landed at Andrews Air Force Base under a sky the color of a lead pipe. The humidity of the Maryland morning hit her like a wet towel, a stark contrast to the dry heat of Jordan. They didn't take her to a brig. They took her to a safe house in the woods of Virginia, a colonial-style home that looked like a suburban dream from the outside, but was lined with lead and copper shielding on the inside. The room they put her in was small but comfortable. A bed, a desk, a window that looked out onto a wall of pine trees, but there were no handles on the inside of the door, and the glass in the window was 3 inches thick. She sat on the bed and waited. 2 hours later, the door opened. It wasn't a colonel this time. It was a woman. She was in her late 50s, wearing a charcoal gray suit and a string of pearls that looked like they cost more than Maya's annual salary. She carried a leather briefcase and a sense of absolute, unshakable authority. "Staff Sergeant Vance," the woman said. She sat in the chair at the desk, crossing her legs with a grace that felt predatory. "I'm Director Aris of the National Security Agency, and I think it's time we stop pretending you're a criminal." Maya didn't move. She didn't respond to the bait. "What am I, then?" "You're a problem," Aris said, opening her briefcase and pulling out a tablet. "A very specific, very expensive problem. We've been monitoring the Fifth Fleet's network since the incident in Jordan. You were right about the handshake. We found the corrupted protocols exactly where you said they would be." Maya felt a brief, cold flash of vindication, but it was quickly swallowed by the look on Aris's face. "However," Aris continued, "we can't shut it down. Every time we try to isolate the code, it migrates. It's using a polymorphic encryption key that we've never seen before. It's effectively turned our own tactical net into a botnet for an unknown actor." "Vane," Maya said. "Julian Vane is a name on a passport that hasn't existed since 2012, Aris said. "The man you were working with is a ghost. We suspect he's part of a private intelligence firm called Apex, but we can't prove it. And right now, Apex is holding our entire regional command structure hostage." Aris leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "But here's the interesting part, Sergeant. The signal isn't just migrating, it's searching. It's looking for a specific handshake, a final sequence to complete the transfer of the Gambury data, and every time you are near a high-gain antenna, the signal spikes." She turned the tablet around. It showed a graph of signal intensity over time. There were 4 massive peaks, all of them corresponding to the moments Maya had been in transit. "You're not just a witness, Vance," Aris whispered. "You're the key. When you touched that transmitter in the vault, when the poison pill triggered that final blast of information, you didn't just see the data. You absorbed the handshake's initialization vector. It's embedded in your neural architecture. Your spatial synesthesia isn't just a gift, it's a storage device." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The data wasn't in her head like a memory. It was in her head like a virus. She wasn't a scout anymore. She was a hard drive. "You want the code," Maya said. It wasn't a question. "I want the handshake stopped," Aris corrected. "But to do that, we need to extract the sequence from you, and the only way to do that is through a high-fidelity neural mapping procedure. It's invasive, and there are risks." "What kind of risks?" "Memory loss, cognitive impairment, in some cases, permanent neurological damage. The data is woven into your sensory processing centers. Pulling it out is like trying to unweave a spiderweb without breaking the silk." Maya looked at the window, at the pine trees she couldn't touch. This was the personal cost arriving in full. They didn't want her expertise. They didn't want her loyalty. They wanted the data, and if they had to break her mind to get it, they would consider it an acceptable loss in the pursuit of national security. "And if I say no?" Aris smiled, a thin, sharp line. "Then you go back to Landstuhl, you sign the confession, you go to Leavenworth for 20 years, and the handshake continues until the Fifth Fleet belongs to the highest bidder. You're a patriot, Sergeant. We both know you won't let that happen." Maya stood up. Her ribs protested, a sharp, stabbing reminder of the physical limits of her endurance. She walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She could feel the itch again, the low-frequency hum of the handshake, calling out to her from the satellites orbiting thousands of miles above. It was a part of her now, a digital ghost in her machine. She thought about Holloway, sitting in his office in Jordan, protecting his career. She thought about Reed, building his scaffold of lies. She thought about Thorne, sitting in a wheelchair in the dark, tapping his temple. Asterisk, I remember. Asterisk, the institution had failed her. It had betrayed her, used her, and now it was prepared to hollow her out. But she was still a scout, and a scout's job wasn't just to find the way out, it was to find the way through. "I'll do it," Maya said, turning to face Aris. "But not here and not with your technicians." Aris raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and who do you propose we use?" "I want Colonel Holloway brought back from Jordan," Maya said, her voice hard and cold. "I want the team that developed the transmitter, and I want Elias Thorne in the room." "Thorne is a liability," Aris snapped. "He's medically unstable." "He's the only one I trust," Maya said. "If you're going to dig into my brain, I want someone there who knows what I look like when I'm whole. Otherwise, you'll just take what you want and leave the rest to rot." Aris stared at her for a long time, calculating the cost of the concession. Finally, she nodded. "Fine, we'll bring them, but we start in 48 hours. The handshake is accelerating. If we don't have the sequence by Friday, the Gambury corridor goes dark." Aris left, the door locking with that familiar heavy click. Maya sat back down on the bed. She was alone again, but the fear was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, dark competence. She knew what they didn't. She knew that the handshake wasn't just a code, it was a conversation, and if she could hear it, she could talk back. She closed her eyes and let the geometry take over. She didn't look for the way out. She looked for the structure of the parasite. She mapped the polymorphic shifts, the recursive loops, the hidden gates. She didn't just remember the code, she lived it. She was the bridge, and she was going to make sure that when the institution crossed it, they weren't prepared for what was waiting on the other side. The following day was a study in institutional pressure. Maya was moved again, this time to a subterranean medical facility beneath Fort Belvoir. It was a place of polished steel and hushed whispers, where the air was filtered through 3 stages of purification, and the walls were lined with monitors that tracked every breath she took. They didn't give her books. They didn't give her a television. They gave her pre-procedure tests, endless batteries of cognitive evaluations, memory puzzles, and sensory deprivation sessions designed to isolate her synesthesia. They were trying to calibrate the extraction to find the exact coordinates of the data in her mind. But the more they probed, the more the handshake fought back. Maya could feel it happening. Every time they hooked her up to the EEG, the violet light in her mind grew brighter. It wasn't just a storage device, it was an intelligence. Vane, or whoever had written the code, had created something that responded to observation. It was a quantum trap. The more you looked at it, the more it changed. By the second night, Maya was barely sleeping. When she closed her eyes, she saw the tactical maps of the Fifth Fleet, the real-time positions of destroyers in the Persian Gulf, the flight paths of drones over the Horn of Africa. It was a sensory overload that threatened to drown her. She was becoming a ghost in the machine, her own identity fraying at the edges as the data tide rose. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, her head in her hands, when the door opened. It wasn't a guard. It was Colonel Holloway. He looked different without the desert dust and the weight of command. He was wearing civilian clothes, a rumpled suit that didn't fit him right, and he looked like a man who had been told he was no longer necessary. He walked into the room and sat in the chair, his hands trembling slightly. "Vance," he said. He didn't look at her. He looked at the floor. "Sir," Maya said. She didn't move. "They brought me back," Holloway whispered. "They told me I was part of a special project. They didn't tell me it was this." "They need a familiar face, Colonel," Maya said, her voice flat. "They need me to stay calm while they drill into my head. You're the designated safety officer for my sanity." Holloway looked up then, his eyes filled with a raw, agonizing guilt. "I'm sorry, Maya, about the report, about everything. They told me that if I didn't frame it as a psychological incident, the entire task force would be disbanded. They told me I was protecting the men." "You weren't protecting the men, sir," Maya said. "You were protecting the institution. And the institution doesn't care about the men, it only cares about the data." Holloway bowed his head. "I know that now. I saw what they did to Thorne. They're putting him in a facility in West Virginia, permanent care, no contact." "Not yet," Maya said. "He's coming here. I made it a condition." Holloway's head snapped up. "Here, to Belvoir, Maya, he can barely speak. He's a ranger," Maya interrupted. "And he's the only one who saw what happened in that vault. He knows what Vane did, and I need him to see what they are about to do to me." She stood up and walked over to him, her shadow falling across his lap. "You have a choice, Colonel. You can be the man who signed that report and walked away, or you can be the man who helps me finish this. Because the handshake isn't just data, it's a weapon. And if Eris gets her hands on it, she isn't going to destroy it, she's going to use it." Holloway looked at her, and for the first time, Maya saw a spark of the officer he used to be, the man who had led men into the notch, the man who had earned his birds in the dirt. "What do you want me to do?" "When the extraction starts," Maya said, her voice a low, steady hum, "the system is going to try to lock me out. It's going to try to consume my neural pathways to protect the data. I need you to bypass the medical overrides. I need you to let the handshake complete." Holloway's eyes widened. "That'll kill you, Vance. Your brain can't handle a full-spectrum data transfer." "It's not a transfer," Maya said. "It's a reflection. I'm going to use the synesthesia to mirror the code back into the NSA net. If they want the handshake, I'm going to give it to them, all of it. Every corrupted byte, every backdoor, every polymorphic shift. I'm going to flood them." "You'll be a vegetable," Holloway whispered. "I'll be a scout," Maya said. "I'll be the one who showed them the truth." Holloway was silent for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the air vents and the distant, rhythmic thud of a door closing in the hallway. 48 hours, he said finally. "That's what they told me. They're bringing the neural mapping rig in tonight." "Good," Maya said. "Tell them I'm ready." Holloway stood up. He reached out as if to touch her shoulder, but he stopped himself. He gave her a sharp, crisp salute, not the salute of a superior to a subordinate, but the salute of a soldier to a comrade who was about to go over the wire. Maya didn't return it. She just watched him leave. She was alone again, but she wasn't empty. The itch at the back of her brain was a roar now. The violet light was a sun burning behind her eyelids. She could feel the Fifth Fleet. She could feel the satellites. She could feel Julian Vane, somewhere in a room with a laptop, waiting for the final handshake. She sat back down on the bed and closed her eyes. The geometry was perfect. The vectors were aligned. The load-bearing stresses were calculated. She wasn't afraid of the cost. She had already paid it. She had lost her career, her health, her partner, and her future. All she had left was the mission. And the mission was the only thing that had ever truly belonged to her. Morning came with the sound of heavy equipment rolling down the hallway. The technicians arrived first, wearing blue scrubs and carrying cases of fiber-optic cables and neural sensors. They moved with a clinical efficiency, setting up the rig in the center of the room. It looked like a high-tech torture device. A chair with a halo of electrodes, a bank of monitors that displayed a three-dimensional model of a human brain, and a series of cooling units that hummed with a deep, ominous vibration. Director Aris arrived an hour later, her face a mask of professional anticipation. She was accompanied by a team of NSA analysts and a contingent of armed guards who stood by the door. "It's time, Sergeant," Aris said. Maya stood up. She walked to the chair and sat down. She felt the cold metal against her skin, the weight of the electrodes as they were pressed against her scalp. She felt the straps being tightened around her wrists and ankles. "Where's Thorne?" she asked. Aris gestured to the door. Two medics wheeled in a gurney. Thorne was lying on it, his face pale, his eyes half closed. He looked small in the vast, sterile room, a broken remnant of the man he had been. But as they positioned him next to the chair, his eyes opened. He looked at Maya and he reached out a trembling hand. Maya took it. His grip was weak, but it was there. "I'm here," he whispered. "I know," Maya said. She looked at Holloway, who was standing by the control console, his face a grim mask. He nodded once. "Initiate the sequence," Aris commanded. The room filled with a high-pitched whine. Maya felt the first surge of energy, a sharp, electric tingle that started at the base of her skull and raced through her nerves. The monitors flared to life, showing the glowing pathways of her brain as the mapping software began its work. "We have a lock," a technician shouted. "The initialization vector is active. It's located in the parietal lobe, centered on the sensory integration nodes. Begin extraction," Aris said. Maya screamed. It wasn't a sound of pain, it was a sound of violation. It felt as if her very soul was being pulled through a needle's eye. The violet light exploded in her mind, a supernova of data that threatened to shatter her consciousness. She saw the handshake. She saw the code. She saw the world being turned inside out. "Signal intensity is spiking," the technician cried. "She's resisting. The code is fighting back." "Increase the gain," Aris shouted. "Don't let it migrate." Maya felt her mind tearing. She felt the memories of her childhood, of the mountains in Montana, of the cold mornings in the Gambari, all being swept away by the tide of data. She was losing herself. She was becoming the handshake. She looked at Thorne. He was watching her, his eyes wide with horror. "Maya," he shouted, his voice cracking. She looked at Holloway. He was staring at the screen, his hand hovering over the override switch. Asterisk now, asterisk Maya thought. Asterisk do it now. Asterisk Holloway hit the switch. The room went dark, not the darkness of a power failure, but the darkness of a total system collapse. The monitors went black, the cooling units died, and the high-pitched whine was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. And then the violet light returned. It didn't come from the monitors. It came from Maya. A dome of energy expanded from the chair, a shimmering, pulsating field that filled the room. The technicians fell back, their hands over their eyes. Aris screamed as the tablet in her hand shattered, the glass fragments glowing with a purple fire. Maya felt the handshake leaving her, but it wasn't being extracted. It was being unleashed. She was the bridge, and the bridge was wide open. The data flooded out of her, a billion-byte-per-second torrent that bypassed the NSA's shielding and surged into the base's internal net. She felt the handshake connecting to the satellites, to the Fifth Fleet, to every secure server in the hemisphere. But she wasn't just sending the data. She was sending the truth. She was sending the recording of Julian Vane in the desert. She was sending the logs of the Gambari mission. She was sending the evidence of the institutional cover-up, the names of the men who had signed the reports, the maps of the hijacked networks. She was giving the handshake to the world. The energy reached a crescendo, a blinding, white-hot flash that felt like the end of everything. Maya felt her heart stop. She felt the final, agonizing snap of the neural pathways, and then there was nothing. The silence that followed was absolute. Maya lay in the chair, her head slumped forward, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The violet light was gone. The room was dark, lit only by the red emergency lights that flickered in the ceiling. She looked up. Thorne was still there, his hand still clutching hers. He was crying, the tears carving clean tracks through the soot on his face. She looked at Holloway. He was standing by the console, his head bowed. He had done it. He had let the bridge open. She looked at Aris. The director was standing in the middle of the room, her suit ruined, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She was staring at a laptop that had somehow survived the blast. "What have you done?" Aris whispered. Maya didn't answer. She didn't have to. On the screen of the laptop, a message was scrolling in a loop. It wasn't the handshake. It wasn't the code. It was a mission report. Staff Sergeant Maya Vance. Scout. Mission complete. Maya closed her eyes. She felt the darkness coming, but it wasn't the darkness of a tomb. It was the darkness of a job well done. She had found the way through. But as her consciousness faded, she felt a final, rhythmic pulse at the back of her brain. The handshake wasn't dead. It had changed again. And somewhere in the world, Julian Vane was looking at a screen, and he was smiling. The reckoning was coming, and Maya Vance was the only one who knew that it had only just begun. The silence that followed the collapse of the neural mapping rig was not empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against Maya's eardrums like the pressure of a deep-sea dive. The red emergency lights of the Fort Belvoir subterranean facility didn't just glow. They throbbed in time with the jagged rhythm of her pulse. The smell of ozone and burnt silicon was so thick she could taste it on the back of her tongue, a bitter metallic flavor that reminded her of the time she'd bitten her lip during a jump at Fort Bragg. She sat in the chair, her body a map of trembling nerves, watching the smoke curl from the shattered monitors. She had opened the door. She had let the handshake out of its cage, and now the world was different. Director Aris didn't move. She stood in the center of the room, her silhouette framed by the flickering emergency lights, her charcoal suit dusted with the fine white powder of a discharged fire suppressor. She looked down at the tablet in her hand. The screen cracked into a spiderweb of dead pixels, and for the first time the predatory grace was gone. She looked old. She looked like a woman who had spent her entire life building a fortress, only to find that the enemy had been invited in through the front gate. The guards at the door were shouting into their radios, but the only thing that came back was static, a dense, rhythmic white noise that Maya recognized. It was the handshake's echo, a digital ghost haunting the very frequency they used for security. Maya's head fell back against the headrest of the chair. The violet light in her mind had dimmed to a dull, aching bruise, but the geometry was still there, albeit fractured. She could see the way the room was built now, the structural weaknesses in the concrete, the hidden conduits behind the walls. She was no longer just a storage device. She was the architect of the crash. "What was in the packet, Sergeant?" Aris asked, her voice a thin, brittle thread. She didn't look at Maya. She was looking at the darkened monitors as if she could force them to yield the secrets they had just broadcasted to every secure node in the Department of Defense. Maya took a breath, and it felt like pulling broken glass into her lungs. "The truth," she whispered. "I didn't just send the handshake. I sent the metadata, every timestamp, every geolocation, every command sequence Julian Vane used to bypass the Gambury uplink. I sent the authorization codes you used to bury the investigation. I sent it to the Inspector General, to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and to every 06 and above in the 5th Fleet's chain of command." Aris finally turned to look at her. Her eyes were dark, fathomless pits of calculation. "You've committed treason, Vance. You've compromised the most sensitive intelligence-gathering operation in the history of the Middle East." "No," Maya said, her voice gaining a hard, flinty edge. "I've performed a field-level purge. You wanted the handshake, Director. You wanted to own it. But you can't own something that's designed to be a mirror. I just made sure the mirror was facing the right way." The door to the chamber hissed open. It wasn't the guards, it was a team of MPs, their faces obscured by tactical helmets, led by a Brigadier General Maya had only seen in briefings. He didn't look at Aris. He walked straight to the console where Colonel Holloway was standing. Holloway hadn't moved since he'd hit the override. He looked like a man who had finally put down a burden he'd been carrying for 1,000 miles. "Colonel Holloway," the general said, his voice echoing in the dead room, Step away from the console. You're being relieved of duty. Holloway nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He looked at Maya, and for a fleeting second there was a ghost of a smile on his face. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of recognition. He turned and walked toward the MPs, his hands held at his sides, palm out. He didn't wait to be told. He knew the cost of what he'd done, and he was walking into it with his head up. The medics moved in then, their boots crunching on the glass. They began to unstrap Maya from the chair, their hands efficient and impersonal. She felt the electrodes being peeled from her scalp, the sticky gel pulling at her hair. As they lifted her out of the chair, her legs gave way. She would have hit the floor if Thorne hadn't reached out from his gurney. His hand caught hers, his fingers locking around her wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible given his condition. Maya looked at him, and the vacancy in his eyes was gone. He was focused. He was a ranger again, even if his body was broken. He pulled her toward him, and she leaned against the side of his gurney, her head resting on the cold metal rail. "We're going," Thorne whispered. His voice was a rasp, but it was clear. "Where, Elias?" Maya asked. "Somewhere they can't find us," he said, but Maya knew better. There was nowhere they could go that the institution couldn't reach. The army was a small town with a long memory. They had broken the machine, but the machine would rebuild itself. It was already happening. She could see it in the way the general was talking to Aris, their voices hushed, their postures shifting from confrontation to collaboration. They were already discussing the containment of the incident. They were already building the new narrative. The transport out of Fort Belvoir was different from the one that brought her there. There were no blacked-out Suburbans. They used a standard army ambulance, the kind with the red cross painted on the side, but the windows were reinforced and the driver was an NCO with a sidearm. Maya and Thorne were placed in the back together. The medics didn't speak. They didn't even look at them. They just checked the Roman IV drips and stared at the floor. Maya watched the lights of Northern Virginia through the small, high window of the ambulance. They were moving south, away from the Pentagon, away from the centers of power. She felt the vibration of the tires on the asphalt of I-95, a rhythmic humming that usually would have triggered a cascade of geometric patterns in her mind. But the patterns were muted now. They were like a radio station drifting out of range, the signal replaced by the static of her own exhaustion. They arrived at a medical facility that Maya didn't recognize. It wasn't a VA hospital. It was a private clinic tucked into the rolling hills of the Virginia countryside, surrounded by a high perimeter fence and guarded by men in tactical gear who didn't wear name tapes. They were taken to separate rooms, but Maya didn't protest. She didn't have the strength. The room was white, sterile, and silent. There was a window, but it was frosted glass. There was a television, but it only played a loop of nature scenes, forests, mountains, oceans. Maya sat on the edge of the bed and watched the images flicker by. She felt like she was watching her own life from a great distance. She thought about the violet light. She thought about the handshake. She thought about Julian Vane. He was still out there. She knew it the way she knew the direction of north. The data she had unleashed had exposed the conspiracy, but it hadn't caught the man. Vane was a ghost, a polymorphic entity that existed in the spaces between the code. He had used her to test the handshake, and she had used the handshake to destroy his infrastructure. But the poison pill was still active in the global net. It was dormant, waiting for a new host, a new frequency. 3 days later, the door to her room opened. It wasn't a guard or a doctor. It was a man in a civilian suit, navy blue, perfectly tailored, with a small silver pin on his lapel that Maya didn't recognize. He was in his mid-60s, with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He didn't carry a briefcase. He carried a single manila folder. "Staff Sergeant Vance," he said. He sat in the chair by the window, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm Undersecretary Miller. I work for the office you didn't know existed until 3 days ago." Maya didn't stand up. She stayed on the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "I imagine there are a lot of offices like that." Miller smiled, a cold, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed. We've spent the last 72 hours cleaning up the mess you made at Belvoir. It was quite a display, Sergeant. You managed to trigger a Level 1 security audit across 3 different intelligence agencies. You also managed to leak classified Gambury operational data to several individuals who were, let's say, not on the approved list. The truth usually isn't on the approved list," Maya said. "The truth is a commodity, Sergeant, and you flooded the market. You crashed the price." Miller opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This is a non-disclosure agreement. It's significantly more comprehensive than the one you signed when you joined the task force. It covers everything from the moment you entered the vault in Jordan to the moment you walk out of this facility. Maya looked at the paper. It was a wall of legalese, a cage made of words. And if I don't sign it? Then we proceed with the court-martial, Miller said, his voice flat. We have enough evidence to convict you of multiple counts of treason, theft of government property, and unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Colonel Holloway has already been charged. Corporal Thorne is being processed for a medical discharge that will strip him of all benefits and leave him in the care of a state-run psychiatric facility. Maya felt a cold, familiar rage beginning to stir in her chest. They were doing it again. They were using the people she cared about as leverage. They were trying to buy her silence with the lives of her team. You think I'll let you do that to Thorne? Meyer asked. It's not a question of what you'll let us do, Sergeant. It's a question of what you're willing to pay to stop it. Miller leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. We don't want to bury you, Vance. We want to use you. Your capability, this spatial synesthesia, is unique. The neural mapping we managed to salvage before the crash shows that you have a sensory integration capacity that exceeds anything we've seen in the human genome. You're not a scout. You're a biological signal processor. And the handshake, it did something to you. It didn't just store data, it optimized your neural pathways. Maya felt a shiver of revulsion. They didn't see her as a soldier. They didn't even see her as a human being. She was a prototype, a proof of concept. I'm done being a project, Maya said. You're never done, Sergeant, not once you've seen the violet light. You can sign this paper, and we will ensure that Corporal Thorne receives the best possible care at a private facility in Montana. He will have his pension, his benefits, and his dignity. Colonel Holloway will be allowed to retire with his full rank and pension, provided he moves to a location of our choosing and remains under surveillance. And me? Meyer asked. You will be officially killed in action during a training exercise at Fort Irwin, Miller said. A tragic accident involving a faulty demolition charge. Your family will receive the flag and the insurance, and you will go to a facility in Colorado where you will help us understand what the handshake did to your brain. You will have a new name, a new life, and a mission that actually matters. Maya looked at the frosted glass window. She thought about her dog in Billings. She thought about her father's cabin, the smell of the pine trees, the way the light hit the mountains at sunset. If she signed that paper, she would never see those things again. She would be a ghost, living in a world of polished steel and flickering monitors, a prisoner of her own extraordinary mind. But if she didn't sign it, Thorne would be destroyed. Holloway would rot in a cell, and the truth she had fought so hard to unleash would be buried under a mountain of procedural delays and national security redactions. She looked at Miller. I want to see Thorne. That's not part of the agreement, Miller said. It's the only part that matters, Maya said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. I want to see him, I want to know he's okay, and then I'll sign your paper. Miller hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door. He was calculating the risk. Finally, he nodded. 10 minutes, no more. They took her to a room at the end of the hall. It was smaller than hers, and it smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. Thorne was sitting in a chair by the bed, his head bowed. He wasn't wearing a hospital gown. He was wearing a gray tracksuit similar to the one Maya had worn in Germany. He looked up when she entered, and the look on his face was enough to break what was left of her heart. He knew what they were asking her to do. Don't do it, Vance, he whispered. Don't sign it. Maya walked over to him and knelt by his chair. She took his hands in hers. They were cold but steady. They're going to take care of you, Elias. You're going to go to Montana. There's a place near the Gallatin River. You'll have the mountains. You'll have the air. I don't want the mountains, Thorne said, his voice cracking. I want the mission. I want the team. The team is gone, Maya said. It's just us now, and I need you to be the one who remembers. I need you to be the one who carries the story, because if we both go into the dark, then the handshake wins. Thorne looked at her, his eyes searching hers. What are they going to do to you, Maya? They're going to try to understand, she said. But they won't. They can map the neurons, they can track the signals, but they can't see the geometry. They can't see the way the world fits together. Only we can see that. She leaned in and pressed her forehead against his. It was a gesture of loyalty, a silent vow that transcended the uniform and the institution. For a moment, the world was quiet. There were no monitors, no guards, no violet light. There was just the two of them, two broken soldiers holding onto each other in the wreckage of a war that had no name. 10 minutes is up, a voice said from the door. Maya stood up. She didn't look back. She walked out of the room and back to her own, where Miller was waiting with a pen. She didn't read the paper again. She didn't need to. She knew what she was signing away. She was signing away Maya Vance. She was signing away the scout. She was signing away her future. She picked up the pen and wrote her name in a sharp, clear hand. Miller picked up the paper and blew on the ink. He looked satisfied. "You've made the right choice, Sergeant. You're going to do great things for this country." "I'm not doing it for the country," Maya said, her voice cold and hollow. "I'm doing it for the man in that room, and if you ever, for 1 second, fail to uphold your end of the bargain, I will find a way to turn every secure net you have into a funeral pyre. And this time, I won't stop at the metadata." Miller didn't flinch. He just nodded and walked out of the room. The next 48 hours were a blur of re-entry procedures. Maya was moved to a different wing of the facility, where she was given a series of physical exams and cognitive tests. They gave her a new name, Sarah Miller, and a new history. She was a civilian contractor who had been injured in a gas leak at a government research facility. She had no family, no friends, no past. On the morning of the third day, they brought her clothes, a pair of jeans, a flannel shirt, and a pair of hiking boots. They were new, stiff, and smelled of a warehouse. She dressed slowly, her ribs still aching, her arms still in a light brace. She looked at herself in the mirror and she didn't recognize the woman looking back. The fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, watchful stillness. They led her to a courtyard at the center of the facility. A black helicopter was waiting, its rotors turning slowly, the downdraft whipping the grass. Miller was standing by the door. "Your transport to Colorado is ready," he said. Maya looked at the helicopter. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of loss. This was it. The door was closing. "Where's Thorne?" she asked. "He was moved this morning," Miller said. "He's on his way to Montana. He'll be settled in by the time you reach Colorado." Maya didn't believe him, but she had no choice. She climbed into the helicopter and buckled her seatbelt. As the machine lifted off, she looked down at the facility. It looked like a castle from the air, a fortress designed to keep the world out and the secrets in. The flight to Colorado was long and silent. Maya watched the landscape change from the lush green of Virginia to the rolling plains of the Midwest, and finally to the rugged, snow-capped peaks of the Rockies. They landed at a remote airstrip near Colorado Springs, where a van was waiting to take her to a mountain facility that didn't appear on any map. The facility was built into the side of a granite cliff, a maze of tunnels and chambers that reminded Maya of the vault in Jordan. But instead of server racks and transmitters, it was filled with labs and observation rooms. There were other people there, men and women in lab coats who moved with a quiet, purposeful energy. They didn't look like soldiers, they looked like scientists. "Welcome to the hive, Sarah," a woman said. She was young, with short-cropped hair and a pair of glasses that looked too big for her face. "I'm Dr. Chen. I'll be your primary liaison." Maya didn't answer. She just followed Chen into the facility, her boots echoing on the polished stone floors. The next 6 months were a cycle of testing and observation. They hooked her up to machines that tracked her brain activity in real time. They gave her puzzles to solve, maps to navigate, and data streams to analyze. They were trying to find the limit of her capability, to see how far the handshake had pushed her. And Maya let them. She gave them just enough to keep them interested, just enough to justify her existence. But she kept the core of herself hidden. She didn't tell them about the violet light. She didn't tell them about the geometry. She didn't tell them that she could feel the facility's network, that she could hear the digital heartbeat of the hive. She was a ghost in their machine, waiting for her moment. She spent her nights in a small, windowless room that was identical to the one she'd had at Belvoir. She would sit on the bed and close her eyes, and she would think about Thorne. She would think about the mountains in Montana. She would think about the dog she'd never see again. But she also thought about Julian Vane. The scientists at the hive were obsessed with the handshake, but they were looking at it from the wrong angle. They saw it as a tool, a way to enhance human cognition. They didn't see it as a predator, but Maya knew. She could feel the handshake evolving, even though it was supposedly dormant. It was communicating with her through the facility's secure net, sending her tiny, rhythmic pulses of information that only she could recognize. It was a conversation, and Vane was on the other end. One night, about 8 months after she arrived at the hive, Maya was sitting at her desk, analyzing a series of encrypted signals from a satellite in the Pacific. The signals were part of a routine training exercise, but Maya noticed a pattern, a recursive loop that didn't belong. She leaned in, her synesthesia flaring to life. The violet light returned, brighter than it had been in months. She saw the geometry of the signal, the way it branched and shifted, mimicking the natural fluctuations of the ionosphere. It was a handshake, but it wasn't the one she knew. It was something new, something more advanced. She felt a sudden, sharp prickling at the back of her brain. The poison pill was waking up. She looked at the monitor and the data began to scroll. It wasn't the training exercise. It was a message. Asterisk hello, Scout. Asterisk Maya felt her heart stop. She looked around the room, but she was alone. The camera in the corner was still blinking its steady red light. The guards were still at their posts. The scientists were still in their labs. Asterisk, I knew you'd find me. Asterisk, the message continued. Asterisk, they think they can cage you. They think they can understand the geometry. But they are just children playing with matches. Asterisk, Maya's fingers hovered over the keyboard. She knew she should report this. She knew she should alert Dr. Chen. But she didn't. She stayed in the violet light. Asterisk, what do you want, Vane? Asterisk, she typed. Asterisk, I want what you want, Maya. I want the truth. The institution is dying. It's a dinosaur thrashing in the tar pits. They're so focused on the data that they've forgotten the world. But you haven't forgotten. You see it for what it really is. Asterisk, Maya felt a cold, hard knot of realization forming in her stomach. Vane wasn't trying to destroy the military. He was trying to replace it. He was building a new network, a private intelligence state that operated outside the boundaries of nations and laws. And the handshake was the key. Asterisk, you're a parasite. Asterisk, Maya typed. Asterisk, I'm an architect. Asterisk, Vane replied. Asterisk, and I'm building a place for people like you. People who can see the connections. People who don't need a flag to know who they are. The hive is just another cage, Maya. But I have the key. Asterisk, the screen flickered, and a set of coordinates appeared. They were for a location in the mountains, about 50 miles from the facility. Asterisk, come and see the world, Scout, before they burn it down. Asterisk, the message vanished and the screen returned to the Pacific satellite data. Maya sat in the silence, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was at a crossroads. She could stay in the hive, a biological signal processor for a dying institution. Or she could go into the dark and see what Vane had built. She thought about Thorn. She thought about the promise she'd made. She thought about the cost of loyalty. She stood up and walked to the door. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a weapon. But she had the geometry. She touched the electronic lock on the door and she felt the pulse. She didn't use a code. She used her mind. She mirrored the lock's internal frequency, creating a resonance that tricked the system into thinking it had been authorized. The lock clicked open. She walked out into the hallway. The lights were dimmed for the night shift. She moved with a quiet, lethal efficiency, bypassing the sensors and the cameras as if they were invisible. She was a scout again. She was in the notch and the enemy was everywhere. She reached the perimeter gate in 20 minutes. The guards were in their shack watching a football game on a small television. Maya didn't look at them. She focused on the gate's control unit. She felt the handshake's echo, a digital hum that vibrated in her fingertips. She sent a command through the net, a simple, polymorphic shift that opened the gate just enough for her to slip through. She stepped out into the cold mountain air. It was a clear night, the stars bright and unforgiving. She looked back at the hive, a dark silhouette against the granite cliff. She had spent her entire life serving the institution, protecting the secrets, fighting the wars. And in the end, the institution had tried to erase her. She turned and began to walk toward the coordinates. The hike took her 6 hours. She moved through the rugged terrain with a grace that surprised her body responding to the pressure of the mission. Her ribs didn't ache. Her arm didn't tremble. She was whole again, but she was different. She was no longer a soldier of the United States. She was a soldier of the handshake. She reached the coordinates just as the sun was beginning to rise. It was a small, high mountain meadow surrounded by ancient pines. In the center of the meadow was a small, unassuming cabin. There were no guards, no fences, no sensors. There was just a man sitting on the porch, a cup of coffee in his hand. Julian Vane. He looked different in person. He was older, his hair gray at the temples, his face lined with the stress of a man who lived in the shadows. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, looking more like a mountain guide than a master of cyber warfare. He looked up as Maya approached and he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a predator, it was the smile of an old friend. "You're early, Scout," he said. Maya stopped at the edge of the porch. She didn't say anything. She just watched him, her synesthesia mapping the geometry of the cabin, the meadow, the man. "Where is he?" she asked. Vane gestured toward the cabin door. "He's inside. He's sleeping. The journey was hard on him, but he's recovering." Maya walked past him and into the cabin. The interior was simple, warm, and smelled of wood smoke. In the corner, on a small bed, was Thorn. He looked peaceful, his breathing steady and deep. He wasn't in a tracksuit. He was in a comfortable sweater, and his hands were folded over his chest. Maya knelt by the bed and touched his hand. It was warm. "How?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Vane stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the morning light. "I have my own extraction teams, Maya, and unlike the NSA, I don't leave my assets behind." Corporal Thorne was never on his way to Montana. He was on his way to a facility in West Virginia where they were going to study his recovery. "I just intercepted the transport." Maya looked at Vane. "Why?" "Because he's the only one who sees you clearly," Vane said, "and because I need both of you for what comes next." "What comes next?" Vane walked over to a small table and opened a laptop. The screen flickered to life, showing a map of the world, but it wasn't a map of nations. It was a map of signals, a complex glowing web of handshakes that covered the entire planet. "The institution is falling, Maya. The old world of borders and flags is being replaced by the world of information, and the people who control that information will control the future. The NSA, the CIA, the GRU, they're all trying to catch up, but they're too slow. They're too burdened by their own bureaucracy." He looked at her, his eyes burning with a dark, visionary intensity. "But we're not. We can see the geometry. We can hear the heartbeat of the world, and together we can make sure that the truth doesn't just survive. We can make sure it rules." Maya looked at Thorne, then back at Vane. She felt the violet light pulse in her mind, a steady, rhythmic humming that matched the web on the screen. She understood now. This was the final handshake. This was the mission she had been born for. But as she looked at Vane, she saw the shadow behind his eyes. She saw the cost of his vision. He wasn't building a better world. He was building a different kind of cage. A cage made of light and code where the only freedom was the one he allowed. She thought about her dog in Billings. She thought about her father's cabin. She thought about the simple, uncomplicated truth of a cold breakfast on a Tuesday morning. "I'm not an asset, Julian," she said, her voice quiet and hard, "and I'm not an architect." Vane's smile faded. "Then what are you, Maya?" "I'm a scout," she said, "and my job is to find the way through." She reached out and touched the laptop. She didn't use the keyboard, she used the geometry. She sent a command through the net, a final, devastating poison pill that she had been building in her mind since the moment she left the hive. The screen flared violet, then went black. Vane lunged for the laptop, but it was too late. The signal was gone. The web was dissolving. The handshake was over. "What have you done?" Vane screamed, his face contorted with rage. "You've destroyed it. You've destroyed everything." "No," Maya said, standing up. "I've just made sure that nobody owns the mirror, not the institution, and not you." She walked to the bed and picked up Thorne. He was heavy, but she carried him with a strength that felt like it came from the mountains themselves. She walked past Vane, who was staring at the dead laptop, his hands trembling. She walked out of the cabin and into the meadow. The sun was fully up now, the light golden and warm. She didn't look back, she didn't look forward, she just walked. She walked until the cabin was a distant speck, until the mountains were her only companions. She walked until she found a small, hidden trail that led down into the valley toward a world that was messy, complicated, and free. She knew the cost. She knew that she was a ghost, a woman with no name and no past. She knew that the institution would never stop looking for her, and that Vane would never forgive her. She knew that her life would be a series of shadows and secrets, a long, lonely trek through the notch. But she also knew that Thorne was breathing. She knew that the truth was still out there, scattered in a billion tiny fragments that no one could ever fully gather again. And she knew that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The recovery was slow, a matter of months spent in a series of safe houses and remote cabins, moving whenever the air felt too heavy or the geometry of a town felt too familiar. Thorne's physical strength returned, though his speech remained a fragmented, rhythmic thing, a code that only Maya could truly decipher. They lived on the fringes of America, using cash and fake IDs, staying in small towns where people didn't ask questions, and the local sheriff was more interested in speeders than national security assets. They eventually ended up in a small town in Wyoming, not far from the Montana border. It was a place of high plains and endless wind, where the sky was so big it felt like it could swallow you whole. They rented a small, weathered house on the edge of town, a place with a porch that faced the mountains. Maya spent her days working as a mechanic at a local garage. She found that the geometry of engines was similar to the geometry of signals, a series of interconnected systems that had a natural rhythm and a specific breaking point. She liked the smell of grease and old oil, the weight of a wrench in her hand, the simple physical satisfaction of making something work again. It was a quiet life, a life of small moments and earned silences. One evening, about a year after they'd left the hive, Maya was sitting on the porch watching the sun set behind the peaks. The wind was blowing, a cold, sharp breeze that carried the scent of coming snow. Thorn was sitting next to her, a blanket draped over his legs, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He hadn't spoken much that day, but as the light began to fade, he reached out and took her hand. "Vance," he said. "Yeah, Elias." "The light," he whispered. "Is it still there?" Maya closed her eyes. She looked inward into the dark architecture of her own mind. The violet light was gone, replaced by a soft, steady glow, the color of a summer dawn. The geometry was still there, but it was no longer a cage. It was a map. "It's still there," she said. "But it's different now. It's quiet." Thorn nodded, a slow, contented movement. "Good. Quiet is good." They sat in the silence, watching the shadows stretch across the plains. Maya felt a sudden, sharp pang of memory. The smell of the vault in Jordan, the scream of the F-15s, the cold, hard weight of the rifle in her hands. It felt like another life, a story she had read in a book a long time ago. But she knew it was real. She could feel the scars on her ribs, the stiffness in her arm, the way her mind still cataloged the frequencies of the world around her. She was still a scout. She was still a soldier. But the war she was fighting now was different. It was a war of survival, a war of keeping the small, fragile things alive in a world that wanted to crush them. She looked at the mountains and she thought about the dog in Billings. She'd never gone back for him. She couldn't. It was part of the cost. But she hoped he was okay. She hoped he was sitting on a porch somewhere, watching the sunset, waiting for a woman who would never come home. The stars began to appear, one by one, piercing the dark velvet of the sky. Maya watched them, her mind automatically tracing the constellations, the orbital paths, the ancient geometry of the universe. She felt a sense of peace that she had never known before, a quiet, steady hope that lived in the spaces between the stars. The institution was still there, somewhere beyond the horizon, rebuilding its machines and guarding its secrets. Julian Vane was still there, somewhere in the shadows, dreaming of his new world. But they didn't matter. Not tonight. Tonight there was just the wind, the mountains, and the man beside her. Maya stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs, the smell of the coming snow sharp and clean. She looked out at the vast, dark expanse of the American West, a land that had seen 1,000 wars and 1,000 silences, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of belonging. She wasn't a hero, she wasn't a traitor, she wasn't a biological signal processor. She was Maya, and she was home. She went back inside and closed the door, the click of the lock, a simple, honest sound that didn't mean anything other than that the day was over. She helped Thorn into bed, tucked the blanket around him, and kissed him on the forehead. "Sleep well, Elias," she whispered. "You too, Scout," he said. Maya walked to the window and looked out at the night. She saw a single, distant light moving across the sky. A satellite, high above the world, carrying its burden of data and dreams. She watched it until it vanished behind the peaks, a tiny, fading spark in the infinite dark. She thought about the orders that had sent her into that valley, the cold breakfast in Jordan, the violet handshake that had changed everything. She thought about the cost of being right, the price of loyalty, and the weight of the secrets she still carried. But mostly she thought about the silence. It was a good silence. A silence that had been earned through blood, fire, and 1,000 miles of road. A silence that didn't need a flag or a uniform to be true. She turned away from the window and went to bed. In the morning, the world would be there. The garage would be open, the engines would be waiting, and the wind would still be blowing across the plains. She would drink her coffee, she would do her work, and she would watch the horizon. She was a scout, after all, and a scout's job was never really done. But for now, there was only the quiet and the dark and the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a woman who had finally found the way through. The snow began to fall shortly after midnight, a soft, white blanket that covered the porch, the garage, and the long, lonely road that led to the mountains. It fell on the silent houses of the town, on the empty fields, and on the graves of the soldiers who had gone before. It fell on the secrets and the lies, on the handshakes and the ghosts, on the past and the future. And in the small, weathered house on the edge of town, Maya Vance slept, her dreams no longer colored by the violet light, but by the simple, enduring geometry of a world that was finally and truly her own. She didn't need the institution to tell her who she was. She didn't need the mission to tell her what to do. She just needed the wind and the stars and the knowledge that she had done what she could with what she had when it mattered most. The rest was just noise, and Maya Vance had always been very good at filtering out the noise. She woke up at 5 before the sun, as she always did. She dressed in the dark, her movements practiced and silent. She made a pot of coffee, the smell filling the small kitchen, and she sat at the table watching the first light of dawn touch the snow-capped peaks. It was a Tuesday morning. She thought about the woman she had been in Jordan, the woman who had eaten a cold breakfast and thought about her dog. She seemed like a stranger now, a person from a story she had almost forgotten. But as she took a sip of her coffee, she felt a familiar, rhythmic pulse at the back of her brain, a tiny, flickering spark that reminded her of the violet light. It wasn't the handshake. It wasn't vain. It was just her, the extraordinary gift she had been born with, finally at peace with itself. She smiled, a small, honest expression that reached her eyes. She stood up, grabbed her coat, and walked out onto the porch. The world was white, silent, and beautiful. She took a breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and she began to shovel the snow from the steps. It was a simple task, a human task, and for Maya Vance it was the only mission that mattered. She finished the steps and stood at the edge of the porch, looking out at the road. It was empty, a long, white ribbon that disappeared into the mountains. She knew that one day someone might come down that road, a man in a suit, a soldier in a uniform, a ghost from her past. But she wasn't afraid. She was ready. She was a scout, and she knew exactly where she was. She went back inside, the smell of coffee and wood smoke welcoming her home. The snow continued to fall, a quiet, steady rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the land. It was a beautiful day. She sat down at the table, picked up her cup, and watched the sun rise over the big sky. The mountains were cold, the air was thin, and she was exactly where she needed to be.